Hello, my friend. Welcome back. Welcome home. If this is your first time here, then I am so glad you found your way. My name is Alan, and this is Sleepy History with Alan, a place where we slow everything down, where we breathe everything in, where we let the soft weight of history carry us gently, gradually, into the deepest, most restful sleep. Here, history is not a list of dates and battles and the names of emperors who conquered things. History is a feeling. It is the smell of bread baking at dusk, drifting up from a stone oven that has been burning since before the sun came up. It is the sound of a child asking one last question before her eyes grow heavy and her voice goes slow. It is the warmth of a lamp flame in a small room, casting its amber glow over the hands of a person who lived 2,000 years ago, a person whose name we will never know, whose face no portrait has preserved, but whose heartbeat, whose tiredness at the end of the day, whose love for the people in the room with her, whose particular satisfaction at a meal that came out right, that we can still, somehow, feel. So, settle in, my friend. Get comfortable now. Take a moment to adjust your pillow to find the exact right angle for your head. Pull your blanket just a little closer. Feel the weight of your body pressing gently, completely, into whatever surface holds you right now. The mattress beneath you, the cushions arranged around you, the softness that has been waiting for you all day, patient and warm, ready for exactly this moment. Let your arms fall where they naturally want to fall. Let your legs go heavy. You have nowhere to be. Nothing is required of you tonight. The only thing asked of you in this whole long restful night ahead is to breathe and to listen and to let the story come. You are safe here, perfectly, completely safe. Tonight we are traveling. Not far, or perhaps farther than you have ever been. We are going back, 2,000 years back, across an ocean, across a continent, across the vast and quiet river of time, to a city that was once the largest, most astonishing, most vibrant city on Earth. A city of 1 million people, or very close to 1 million. Historians debate the exact number, but all agree it was extraordinary beyond anything that had come before it. A city of marble temples and dusty alleys, of senators in their togas and children chasing cats through the narrow streets, of philosophizers and fishmongers and fullers up to their knees in enormous vats of cloth and water. A city that smelled of bread and garlic and the smoke of 1,000 cooking fires, all rising at once into a warm Mediterranean evening sky that was, on the clearest nights, so full of stars it looked like someone had scattered salt across a piece of dark velvet and left it there to shine. A city called Rome. Now, I know what you might be imagining. The Colosseum, perhaps, vast and golden in the afternoon sun, its shadow falling long across the Forum below. The Forum itself, all those gleaming columns, that forest of marble rising from the heart of the city. Julius Caesar, Augustus, the long processions of marble emperors, staring out from their plinths with their blank, perfect, slightly unsettling gaze. The aqueducts striding across the Roman countryside on their enormous arched legs, carrying water from the mountains to the city's million thirsty mouths. And yes, all of that was there. All of that was real. All of that is part of the story. But that is not where we are going tonight. Tonight we are going somewhere much quieter, much more intimate, much more real, in the way that ordinary life is always more real than monuments, more real than the inscriptions on the marble and the proclamations of the powerful. The truest things about any civilization are not in its grandest buildings, but in its smallest rooms. Not in the speeches of its emperors, but in the conversations at its supper tables. Not in the histories written by those who watched events unfold from a position of power and comfort, but in the daily texture of the lives of the people who lived those events from the inside, from the ground floor, from the second floor of a brick building in a noisy neighborhood, going about the endlessly repeated, endlessly necessary, endlessly human work of keeping a household alive. We are going to a street in the Subura, a neighborhood that sat at the very heart of ancient Rome, tucked between the Esquiline and the Viminal hills, running down into the valley between them, humming with life from the moment the bakers lit their ovens before dawn to the last carts grinding over the paving stones in the small hours of the morning. The Subura was, by ancient accounts, one of the most densely populated and most thoroughly alive neighborhoods in Rome. It was not elegant. The wealthy would not have chosen to live there if they had any other option. But it was real. It was Rome at its most unfiltered, its most human, its most itself. We are going to a particular building on a particular evening, a building that was home to dozens of families, stacked one above the other in their small apartments, living their lives in rooms full of warmth and noise, and the particular kind of love that flourishes in close quarters, that grows up through the cracks between people who have no choice but to know each other, and eventually finds, in many cases, that it is glad of it. This building was called an insula. The word is Latin, and it means simply island, an island of people in the great sea of the city. And inside this island, on this warm evening in the 1st century of the Common Era, sometime during the reign of an emperor whose name we needn't concern ourselves with tonight, because this story is not about emperors, there is a woman, a mother, a wife, a freedwoman, which is to say a woman who was once enslaved and who earned or was granted her freedom, as many people did in the complex and often paradoxical world of Roman slavery. A woman who came to Rome from somewhere else, as so many Romans did, for Rome was a city of immigrants and freed people and traders from every corner of its enormous empire, and who made a life here, as so many Romans did, in 4 small rooms on the 2nd floor of a building that leaned slightly to the left and smelled of the bakery below and was, in every way that mattered to her home. Her name history has not preserved for us. No inscription bears her name. No tombstone survives with her face. No writer of her time thought her life worth recording, because writers of her time were mostly interested in other kinds of lives. But her evening, her quiet, ordinary, luminous, entirely sufficient evening, that I think we can imagine. That I think we can almost touch. You are warm and completely comfortable. Take a long, slow breath in through your nose. Hold it for just a moment, feeling the fullness of it, and let it out slowly, very slowly, through parted lips, feeling your shoulders fall, your jaw unclench, your hands go soft and open on whatever they are resting against. Good. We are about to walk through a door that has been closed for 2,000 years and find out what was always there on the other side, what has always been there on the other side of every closed door in every ordinary house, in every ordinary neighborhood, in every century of human life. A family sitting together in the last golden light of the day. Are you ready, my friend? Then let us begin. Close your eyes, or let them rest unfocused on whatever soft surface is before you, and imagine very gently that you are rising above the city you know, above the roads and the rooftops and the orange glow of the streetlights, above the sound of the world you have been in all day, higher and higher, slowly and without effort, the way you sometimes rise in dreams, with a sense of the air thinning, of the landscape below becoming abstract and beautiful, of the details dissolving into a larger shape. The lights below you are like scattered stars, reflected up from the ground. The sounds diminish. The air is cool and clean. You are very high up now, and it is very quiet, and it is very good. And now, slowly, gently, without any effort at all, you begin to let yourself drift backward, not in space but in time. The lights below you are beginning to change. The roads are narrowing, the paving stones returning under asphalt. The shapes are shifting. The concrete is giving way to brick, and then to the older, warmer colours of handmade terracotta tile, roof lines of deep ochre and faded red glowing in the late afternoon sun of a Mediterranean September. The sounds, even from up here, are changing. No engines, no electric hum, just the organic, layered sound of a city made entirely of people and animals, and the things people make with their hands. And the smell. Even here, high in the warm air above the city, you can smell it. The smell of ancient Rome rising on the thermals of a day's accumulated warmth. Bread, first and foremost, the particular rich, yeasty, primal smell of bread baking in a stone oven. A smell so fundamental to human civilization that it might be the oldest comfort smell there is. Garlic and olive oil. Wood smoke, many different kinds of wood smoke from many different kinds of fire. The mineral smell of warm stone, sun-soaked limestone and tufa and brick that has been radiating absorbed warmth all day and is only beginning to give it back. The smell of a river, faintly, the Tiber somewhere to the west, its particular note of damp earth and moving water threading through everything else. This is Rome, and you are drifting down, through the warm evening air, into the sound and the smell of it, down toward a particular neighborhood in the center of the city, the Subura, where the streets are narrow enough that people on opposite balconies could pass things to each other without descending to the street, where the noise has been continuous since the city woke, where the life is dense and layered and urgent and warm. You drift lower. The buildings rise around you. The streets narrow below you into channels barely wide enough for two people to walk abreast. The sounds resolve into individual sounds now. The creak of a cartwheel on stone, a vendor calling something in the particular rhythmic cadence of street sellers, the bark of a dog answered by a dog on a different street, the laughter of children playing some complicated game in the alley below, the steady metallic ring of a metal worker 2 streets over making something with a hammer, all of it washing together into the warm, low, continuous music of a city that is alive. And now here, stop. This building, right here on this particular street, 4 stories of warm brick, slightly irregular in the way of buildings that were built in stages over decades rather than all at once. The upper stories set back slightly from the lower ones, a wooden balcony on the 2nd floor with a rope strung between its post and the shuttered window frame, from which a piece of cloth hangs in the still air. The building leans ever so slightly to the east, barely visible, but there, a slight lean that it has had for years, and that everyone in the building has long since stopped noticing. There is laundry on the rope. There is a clay pot on the balcony railing. There is, drifting from somewhere within, the smell of lentils and cumin beginning their long, slow, fragrant conversation with heat. And at the corner of the building, at street level, the wide wooden shutters of a bakery stand open to the cooling evening air, and the last warmth of the day's baking radiates from within, adding its particular goodness to the street's already generous atmosphere of smell. This is our insula. This is our island. This is where we are spending the evening. The door at the foot of the stairs is open. It is usually open in the warmer months, when closing it would mean trapping the day's heat in the stairwell. Step inside, my friend. The air is close and warm, carrying the compressed essence of a building full of families. Cooking smells from every floor, the faint sweetness of the packed earth smell that stone and tile develop when they have been warm all day, the particular scent of many people living in proximity. The stairwell is narrow. The walls are plastered and painted, a deep red at the bottom, faded to the colour of old brick, with a band of painted honeysuckle at about shoulder height that someone applied years ago and that has been slowly flaking since. The stairs themselves are stone, worn smooth into the centre by years of feet, hundreds of thousands of footsteps, tens of thousands of trips carrying water and food and children and goods and everything else that a building full of families requires. The 3rd step creaks. It has always creaked. Everyone in the building knows to step to the left on the 3rd step, and most of them do, and the ones who don't are revealed as visitors. We are climbing, now slowly, to the 2nd floor. One hand on the wall for balance. The wall is warm and slightly rough under your palm, the texture of old plaster that has been painted over several times. The sounds of the building are all around us. A baby's voice on the floor above, cycling through its small repertoire of sounds. A man's voice, somewhere. The low drone of someone talking at length to someone who is mostly listening. From behind a closed door on the landing, the smell of frying onions, sharp and golden and irresistible. Here, 2nd floor. The landing opens out slightly, wider than the stairwell, with a small window at the end that faces the interior courtyard, through which, if you lean slightly, you can see the narrow strip of sky above the building's interior air shaft, and below, the small rectangle of the courtyard, where a fig tree grows in a clay pot, stubborn and cheerful, in about 6 inches of actual sunlight per day. The door to our apartment is slightly ajar. The smell of lentils is stronger here. From within, the sound of a child's voice asking something, and then the voice we have come to hear, warm, slightly distracted, patient, answering, "We are home. Let's stay a while." There is something I find deeply moving about the word insula. It means island, and when you stand in the middle of one, when you imagine yourself in the narrow stairwell of a Roman apartment block, the walls pressing close, the sounds of other lives filtering through the ceiling above and the floor below and the thin partitions on either side, you understand exactly why they called it that. It is an island, a small self-contained world, floating in the larger, more turbulent sea of the city. A place where dozens of families live in proximity so close that they know each other's rhythms, each other's voices, each other's moods, by the quality of sound coming through the walls, where the boundaries between one family's life and another's are not solid walls but porous membranes, whispers and cooking smells, and the particular acoustics of laughter in a narrow stairwell. The insulae of ancient Rome were, by any measure, a remarkable achievement of urban living. Consider what Rome was in the first century of the Common Era. By the best estimates of historians and archaeologists working from census records, grain dole tallies, and the physical evidence of the city's extent and density, Rome housed somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million people within its walls. Possibly more if you included the suburbs spreading out beyond the Aurelian Wall. It was a number without precedent in the Western world, a density of human habitation that no city in Europe or the Americas would approach for over 1,000 years. To put it in some perspective, at the height of Rome's population, the city was packing more people into its square miles than almost any modern city today. And this was without elevators, without central heating, without running water above the ground floor, without refrigeration, without electric light, without any of the technological systems we now consider the basic prerequisites of urban living. To house all those people, the Romans built upward. This seems obvious when you say it. Of course they built upward. What else could you do? But the decision to build multiple-story residential buildings was not universal in the ancient world, and the Romans developed it to a particular sophistication. The typical insula rose between 3 and 6 stories above the street. Some were reportedly taller. Augustus, famously, set a height limit of 70 Roman feet for insulae in the city, a rule that was obeyed with the usual Roman combination of official compliance and creative workaround. Our building, this particular insula in the Subura, leaning its familiar slight lean toward the east, is 4 stories tall. 4 stories of brick and timber and terracotta tile and the accumulated warmth of the many lives lived within it. The ground floor, as in most insulae, was given over to shops. The Romans called them tabernae, a word that gives us our word tavern, though Roman tabernae could sell almost anything, not just wine. They were small, single-room commercial spaces that opened directly onto the street, their wide wooden shutters folded back during the day to display their wares or services, or simply to let the street life in. In our building, the ground floor held 3 tabernae, the shoemaker's workshop at the front, where our protagonist's husband spent his working hours bent over his last, cutting and stitching leather by the light from the open frontage. A small wine shop next to it, 2 amphorae always visible inside, the proprietor usually visible too, a heavy-set man who leaned in his doorway in the late afternoon and conducted an apparently endless series of brief conversations with everyone who passed. And at the corner, the bakery. The bakery was technically in the adjacent building, but its stone oven was built into the shared wall and its warmth radiated through both structures, especially in the lower floors, creating the constant, gentle, deeply comforting background temperature of bread making that all the building's residents had long since stopped consciously noticing and would only be aware of, sharply and with feeling, if it were ever to stop. Just breathe, my friend. You're warm and safe, and there's nowhere to be. Let the building settle around you, the way it always does at this hour. Above the tabernae, the building stepped back slightly at each floor, a design feature you can see in the best-preserved Roman apartment buildings that survive at Ostia Antica, the ancient port town near Rome that was essentially buried and preserved by abandonment rather than volcanic ash, and which gives us our clearest picture of what Roman urban architecture actually looked like in daily use. The upper floors had wooden balconies called maeniana, projecting platforms that stuck out over the street below and gave the upper floor residents a way to feel the movement of the air and participate in the street life without having to navigate the stairs. Our woman liked her balcony. In the evenings, especially in the long, slow evenings of summer and early autumn, she would stand there for a few minutes before the cooking began, leaning on the wooden railing with her arms crossed and her chin resting on her forearms, looking down at the street below, at the flow of people, the constant, purposeful flow of Rome going about its business, at the dogs, of which Rome had many, trotting from one smell to the next, with the focused purposefulness of creatures who have somewhere to be and know exactly where it is, at the children playing in the narrow strip of shade along the building's wall opposite, their complicated game involving a great deal of shrieking and a small round stone and rules that seemed to change every time she watched. She loved these minutes. They were her personal transition, the brief pause between the day's work and the evening's work, the moment when she was neither doing anything nor waiting to do anything, just standing there, warm and slightly tired, part of the street below and part of the building behind her, belonging equally to both. The rooms of a typical insula were small by our standards, and even by the standards of other ancient cultures. The Romans were a practical people when it came to urban housing, and practicality in Rome meant making the most of every square foot of floor space. The wealthiest tenants, or the relatively wealthier tenants, since no one who lived in an insula was truly wealthy, occupied the lower floors. This was not the way we might arrange things today, where the higher floors command the higher rents and the better views. In Rome, lower was better. Fewer stairs to climb with your water and your groceries, less distance for the servants or children to go when something needed fetching, and crucially, less exposure to the fire risk that came with being above other people's cooking fires and lamps. The higher you lived in an insula, the cheaper the rent and the greater the risk. Our family. The woman, her husband, their daughter of perhaps 7 years, and their son of perhaps 14, lived on the second floor, which placed them in the comfortable middle. Not the ground floor, which was noisier and less private, the street life pressing close. Not the third or fourth floor, with their greater fire risk and their greater distance from the water fountain at the street corner. The second floor was a reasonable balance, and their apartment, while modest, was a reasonable home. They had 4 rooms, a main room about 15 feet square that served as their combined living, dining and sleeping space, where the adults slept on sleeping mats that were rolled against the wall during the day. A smaller inner room, about 8 feet by 10, where the children slept and where the family's most important possessions were stored in a wooden chest. Access to the wide landing at the top of the first staircase, shared with the 2 other apartments on their floor, which stood in the evenings as the communal cooking area. Its stone floor darkened with years of small brazier fires and oil drips, and the accumulated carbon of 100,000 meals, and a tiny additional space, barely large enough to stand in, that served as storage for the household's clay amphorae and the baskets and the fuel for the brazier. The walls of their rooms were plastered and painted in the Roman fashion. The main room was the ochre yellow that was one of the most common colours in Roman domestic interiors, a warm, earthy tone that the Romans made from iron oxide pigment and that aged beautifully, deepening and mellowing over the years until it was exactly the colour of old honey or warm sandstone in afternoon light. Along the top of this wall, about a foot below the ceiling, someone had painted a border of running vines and stylized flowers. Not expensive work, not the elaborate wall paintings of wealthy houses, but decent, cheerful work that had been there since before this family moved in, and that the woman had always quietly liked. The inner room was unpainted plaster, cool and white. The floor throughout was terracotta tile, plain, undecorated, swept every morning because the city's dust had a way of finding every gap and every crack and settling itself there in patient layers that returned immediately after every sweeping, like a tide. There was no running water on the upper floors. This was simply a fact of Roman urban life that required daily management. Every morning, and usually again in the evening, water had to be carried up from the street. Rome had extraordinary aqueducts, 11 of them by the 1st century CE, engineering achievements that are still studied and admired today, capable of delivering hundreds of millions of gallons of water to the city every day from sources in the mountains many miles away. The city was full of public fountains fed by these aqueducts, beautiful, practical, constantly running, their overflow channeling down grooves in the street surface in a continuous gentle flow that also served to flush the city's waste toward the great sewers below. Every neighborhood had its fountains. Water was essentially free to any Roman citizen who could carry it. The issue was the carrying. Every drop of water used in an upper floor apartment had to be carried up the stairs in heavy clay amphorae by human effort, usually by the person in the household who was most available and most able, which in this case was the son, who had been taking on this task for 2 years now, with the combination of efficiency and barely concealed pride of a teenager, who has recently become capable of something useful. What I find quietly extraordinary about the Insulae, thinking about them here in the evening quiet, is this contradictory nature they contained. Remarkable on one hand, challenging on the other, and the people who lived in them navigating that contradiction every day with the matter-of-fact competence of people who have never known anything else and find nothing particularly remarkable about their own arrangements. It is always thus. with the ordinary conditions of ordinary life. You do not know what you are accustomed to until you try to describe it to someone who is not. The fire risk was real and significant. Roman law repeatedly addressed it. Roman writers mentioned it. The archaeological evidence of fire-damaged and reconstructed insulae in Ostia confirms that fires happened with some regularity. The response to this was not to stop building insulae. There was no alternative, really, if Rome was going to house its population, but to develop a set of practices and precautions that became embedded in the culture of insular living. You kept your brazier away from the walls. You did not overfill your lamp. You did not leave your cooking fire unattended. You knew where your neighbours' fires were burning, because you needed to know, because the same fire that might destroy your neighbour's apartment would not stop at the wall. There was, in this shared fire awareness, a kind of enforced community. You paid attention to what the people around you were doing, because your safety was genuinely linked to theirs. This was not comfortable, exactly, but it was real, in the way that shared stakes make things real. She had been living in this building for 11 years. She knew it the way you know a living thing. Its sounds, its rhythms, its particular character at different times of day and different seasons of the year. She knew which floorboard above her bedroom creaked at exactly 11 on certain nights, which meant that the man upstairs was doing his late-night pacing again. She knew that the building was warm in winter, warmer than you'd expect, because the bakery's oven ran almost continuously and the warmth seeped up through the floors. She knew that on the east side of the building, in the afternoon, the interior courtyard caught and concentrated the sun in a way that made it pleasant to sit there in autumn and spring, but nearly unbearable in high summer. She knew the building's voice, the sum of all its sounds, and could read it like a text, noting deviations and absences and new additions the way you read a familiar face. This knowledge was, in its way, a form of intimacy. Not the intimacy of chosen relationship, but the intimacy of shared space over time, which is its own profound thing. She was intimate with this building, the way she was intimate with her own body. Not always consciously, not always appreciatively, but deeply, thoroughly, in the way of long cohabitation. What stays with me, thinking about all of this, is not the challenges of insular life. It is the normalcy of it. The way this building, with all its cramped rooms and its shared landing and its borrowed warmth from the bakery below, was simply home. Simply the place where her life happened, where her children grew up, where her husband's hands knew the exact dimensions of the workspace, where the third step on the staircase had been creaking since before any of them arrived, and would creak long after they were gone. Home is not a place. Home is a feeling, and the feeling was here, in this building, in this city, on this warm evening in the first century of the Common Era, as it has always been, everywhere people have made it, in all the thousands of years of human building and human dwelling. The building breathes around her, the city breathes below, and on every floor, one by one, the lamps are beginning to glow. The light at this particular hour has a quality that cannot quite be reproduced. It is the light of late afternoon going into early evening in September in Rome, which is a city built on 7 hills, and therefore a city of complicated light. Light that catches different surfaces at different angles, light that bounces and reflects in ways that a flat city's light does not, light that turns the warm stone colours of the buildings into something that looks, at the right moment, in the right mood, almost burnished. The particular stripe of it that comes now through the street-facing window of the main room falls across the tile floor at a low angle, warm and precisely diagonal, catching the fine dust that floats in the air above it. Always there, always floating, as if the air itself is breathing out its own slow exhalations. The dust motes drift in patterns too complex to follow, too beautiful to look away from. She stands at the window for a moment, just for a moment. The pot needs tending, and her daughter is somewhere nearby asking questions in that way she has. And her husband's voice drifts up from the workshop below, the particular rhythm of a craftsman addressing a customer with the careful courtesy of someone whose reputation depends on being easy to work with. But for this one moment, she stands at the window, and she lets the light fall across her hands where they rest on the sill, and she notices it. She notices the light. This is something she has always done. This noticing of the light at this hour, this annual round of particular lights that mark the seasons in this particular room, this particular window. The summer light, later and more golden. The The winter light, slanted and cold and arriving and departing earlier than you wanted it to. The spring light, uncertain and clean. This autumn light, which she thinks is the best of all. The warmest, the most lingering, the most inclined to stay a few minutes past its welcome and glow. The street below her window is in the particular state of late afternoon Roman street life. The busiest part of the working day is over. The markets have been winding down since mid-afternoon, the heaviest labour finished. The professional and commercial traffic thinning out. But the streets are not quiet, not yet, not nearly. There is a steady flow of people moving in both directions. Women returning from the water fountains with their amphorae, balanced on hip or shoulder or head, with the practiced ease of long habit. Men moving in twos and threes, talking with the gestures of people finishing or starting an argument. Children, in clusters and singly, involved in the complicated social calculations of children, at large in a familiar neighbourhood. A vendor with a small cart. She cannot see what he is selling from this angle, only the cart and the small crowd around it, and the particular quality of focused attention that people bring to the transaction of buying something they have decided they need. The neighbourhood has a sound in the late afternoon that is different from its morning sound, different from its midday sound, different from the deep night sound she knows, as well as she knows her own breathing. Right now the sound is settling, not quieting exactly, but settling, becoming less effortful. The sharp commercial notes of the day giving way to the softer social notes of the evening. Neighbours calling to each other across the narrow street or down from their balconies. The sound of dishes, somewhere, being arranged. The particular territorial bark of a dog who has decided that the corner across the way belongs to him and is explaining this decision to anyone who passes too close. Just breathe easy, my friend. Let the evening find its rhythm. You're warm, you're still, you're exactly where you need to be. The world can have its noise. It's not for you right now. Just let it go by. She took a long breath through her nose. In through the nose. That is how she has always breathed. Deep breaths that she takes without thinking about it, that bring in the full inventory of the evening air. Garlic frying. From somewhere above. That would be the family on the third floor. The ones with the extended family arrangement. The grandmother who cooked from mid-afternoon and never seemed to stop. A warm, sweet undertone of cumin and something slow-cooked. That was hers, her lentils, which had been going since before noon, building their depth of flavour through the long, patient hours of slow heat. And underneath everything, the smell of the bakery below. Not the sharp, fresh smell of hot bread from the oven. That smell had passed earlier in the day, but the residual smell that a bakery carries all day and into the evening, warm and yeasty and deeply comforting, like a smell memory of every good bread you have ever eaten. The interior courtyard of the Insula, visible through the other window, the one that faced inward, was a small rectangle of open sky framed by the building's four walls. Small is not quite right. It was barely 6 feet across, really more of an air shaft than a courtyard, a vertical channel of space between the inner walls of the building, but it was important beyond its size. It let light into the interior rooms of the building that would otherwise have been in complete darkness. The rooms without street-facing windows, the rooms that had only this small slice of sky to remind them that they were not entirely enclosed. And it let sound travel in both directions and in all directions simultaneously. The courtyard was the building's acoustic heart, the place where sound from every floor entered a shared space and mingled into something that was more than the sum of its parts. The building's voice. Standing at her courtyard window, with her arms folded on the sill, she could hear, right now, a continuous overlapping murmur of lives in progress on every floor. The particular laugh of the elderly freedman on the third floor, who had the habit of laughing at his own jokes just before he reached the punchline. A laugh that arrived a beat too early and gave everything away, which was somehow endearing rather than annoying, which was a quality she had come to associate with him generally. This tendency to give things away before they were meant to be given. The patient, repetitive murmur of the young mother on the floor directly above, to talking her baby through some difficulty, using the same phrases over and over in the ancient rhythm of parental soothing. All the words translatable down through the centuries. None of the words actually mattering. What matters only the voice and the rhythm and the warmth in it. The sound of something being set down firmly on a wooden surface somewhere below. The brief clunk of it, and then silence, and then the resumption of whatever had been going on before the setting down. These were the sounds of her life, as familiar as furniture. She had been listening to versions of these sounds in this building for 11 years. Before that, she had lived in a different building, also in Rome, also on an upper floor, but the sounds there had been different, had not quite organized themselves into the particular composition she now thought of as simply the sound of home. Here she knew every instrument. She could hear new developments in the usual music. A new family who had moved in on the 4th floor 2 months ago, their children's voices still occasionally carrying something unexpected, a phrase or a pattern that she had not yet fully incorporated into her map of the building's life, so that when she heard it, she still experienced a small moment of attention before recognition settled in. Her daughter appeared now, rounding the corner of the sleeping room, with the sudden purposeful energy of a 7-year-old who has completed one thing and is already in search of the next. She was a slight child, serious-faced, with the particular combination of her father's deliberate brows and her mother's quick, dark eyes that gave her an air of weighing things, even when she was asking about supper. She came to lean against her mother's leg, not clingingly but companionably, a lateral press of contact that said, "I am here, and you are here, and we are both in this room together, which is a good and sufficient thing." She asked, "Are we almost?" Her mother said, "Nearly." She said, "What is it?" Her mother said, "Lentils." She said, "With the fig?" Her mother said, "Yes, with fig." She considered this. She said, "Is it the good kind?" Her mother said, "It should be. I left it long enough this time." A pause, during which the daughter leaned more fully against her mother's side and looked out the window with the same proprietary gaze her mother had been giving the street a few minutes before. As if this window and this street and this view belonged to her, which in every way that mattered they did. She said, "I saw a chicken today." Her mother said, "Where?" She said, "On the 3rd step of the stairs going to the street." Her mother said, "What was it doing?" She said, "I think it was lost." Her mother said, "Did you give it something?" She said, "I wanted to, but I didn't have anything." A pause. She said, "Do you think it found its way home?" Her mother said, "Chickens usually do, one way or another." Her daughter appeared to find this satisfactory. The son was on the stairs. She could hear him now, not his footsteps specifically, but the particular quality of footsteps that belonged to a teenager, which was heavier than necessary and slightly more emphatic than the situation called for. The footstep of a person who was in the process of becoming larger than he had previously been, and was still calibrating the relationship between his new size and the space around him. He was coming up. Good. She had half wondered if he would stop at the wine cellars, not for wine, that was not the concern, but for conversation, because he had recently developed the habit of stopping to talk to anyone who seemed willing to talk, a hunger for new input from outside the familiar walls of family life that she recognized and understood and occasionally found inconvenient. He appeared in the doorway and said, "What's for supper?" She said, "Lentils." He said, "Again?" She said, "Yes, again. You like lentils." He considered whether this was worth an argument. He decided it was not. He came in and sat down on the cushion near the courtyard window, with the boneless quality of teenage sitting, his back against the wall, his legs out in front of him, and took up, without any particular intention, the function that teenagers often serve in a household at this hour. The function of being present, adding their particular energy to the room, making the room feel occupied and warm in a way that it would not feel without them. The street below was beginning to sound like evening. She could hear it clearly, even without looking. The shift in the quality of the human sound, the slowing of the commercial traffic, the beginning of the social traffic. The day was done, or nearly done. People were heading home, or heading to the public baths, or heading to visit the friend they had been meaning to visit all week. The neighborhood was settling into itself the way a person settles into a chair at the end of a long day, with a certain audible relief, a certain giving up of effort, a certain willingness to be still. She turned from the window, she checked the pot, she straightened up, stretching her back, feeling the long day in it. She wiped her hands on the cloth at her belt. She looked at her daughter, and then at her son, and then at the door, where in a little while her husband would appear. The evening was beginning. It was, in every particular, exactly as it should be. There is fire at the centre of every home that has ever been a home. Not metaphorical fire, though that too, always that too, but actual, real, physical fire. the low orange glow of coals in a brazier, pulsing with a slow warmth that is almost like breathing. The careful balance of heat and air that a cook has spent years learning to read, the way a gardener reads soil or a sailor reads the sea. Intuitively, quickly, through the accumulated intelligence of the body rather than the deliberate attention of the mind. The smell of burning charcoal, which is not a clean smell exactly, but is a profoundly domestic smell, a smell that registers at some deep level as safety, warmth, as the promise of food, as the signal that someone somewhere is doing the work of turning raw ingredients into something that will nourish the people who come to the table. The Romans heated and cooked their food on portable braziers, small, practical devices made of iron or terracotta, designed to hold a bed of burning charcoal at the right height for a pot or pan to rest above it. They were found in nearly every Roman home, from the grandest townhouse to the most modest single room in the highest story of the least prestigious insula in the city. They were also, as every Roman knew, extremely dangerous. The combination of portable fire, wooden building frames, closely packed apartment buildings, and the inexhaustible capacity of human beings for distraction and negligence created a fire risk that was constant and real, and that Roman law attempted to manage, and Roman writers did not tire of mentioning. Pliny the Elder, writing in the same century as our story, included fire among the great hazards of Roman urban life, alongside the ever-present risk of building collapse, and the rather more comic hazard of objects falling from upper-story windows. The Great Fire of 64 CE, which destroyed large portions of Rome during the reign of Nero, started in the dense commercial district near the Circus Maximus, and was fueled by exactly the combination of materials and conditions that characterized insular neighborhoods throughout the city. And yet the brazier burned on, evening after evening, in every apartment on every floor of every insula, because there was no alternative. You could not eat raw food indefinitely. You needed warmth in winter. You needed to boil your water sometimes in times of illness or doubt. The fire was necessary, and necessity, as Romans knew as well as anyone, has a way of making things feel normal, even things that are genuinely risky. Even things that would strike an outsider as alarming. You adjusted. You became careful in a particular way, the way that people who live with genuine risk become careful. Not anxious, not paralyzed, but attentive, trained by long habit to the relevant signals, alert in the background to the things that needed alertness. You're warm and safe, my dear friend. The fire in this story burned long ago, in a world completely separate from yours. You're here, resting, and there is nothing but warmth and quiet, and the soft movement of the story around you. Just let yourself be held. She was careful with her brazier. This was one of the things she had been careful about from the very first day in this building, and that she had never let herself become casual about. No matter how routine the evening fire had become, she kept the brazier away from the walls. She kept it on its terracotta trivet on the stone landing rather than inside the room, because the landing was stone all the way through, and the room had a wooden threshold that she did not trust. She did not leave the fire unattended, or when she did, she banked it first, reducing the oxygen, letting the coals settle into a lower, steadier heat that could be left alone for a few minutes, while she went back inside to check on the children or fetch something from the inner room. The charcoal itself mattered enormously. Good charcoal, properly carbonized, from quality wood, prepared by a skilled charcoal maker, burned hot and even and with relatively little smoke, which was important both for the quality of the cooking and for the air quality in the stairwell and the neighboring rooms. She bought her charcoal from a specific seller who set up on the 3rd Street East on certain mornings, a small man from somewhere in the south of Italy who sold from a sack that was always roughly the same size and who had, apparently, an inexhaustible supply of well-made charcoal and an apparent indifference to conversation. She bought enough for 2 or 3 days at a time, because charcoal was not expensive, and carrying it was not difficult, but it was bulky, and the storage space was limited, and there was a particular satisfaction in having exactly what you needed. Not more, not less. Tonight's brazier had been started carefully. She had laid the tinder first, a small bundle of dry plant fibers kept in a clay pot specifically for this purpose. Fibers she gathered from the basket she kept under the sleeping shelf, replenished regularly and kept carefully dry, because wet tinder was useless tinder, and discovering this at the moment you needed fire was deeply frustrating. On the tinder, Small twigs from the bundle she kept alongside the tinder, arranged in the way her mother had taught her, not piled but placed, deliberate and airy, giving the flame room to breathe and climb. Then, when the twigs were going properly, the charcoal, set around and above the burning twigs with the care of someone who has done this so many times that the care is automatic, doesn't require thought, is simply what the hands do. Then patience. The first 20 minutes of a charcoal fire are the fire's own time, not the cook's. You cannot rush it. You can encourage it. You can fan it gently if it seems sluggish. You can adjust the arrangement if a particular piece of charcoal is smothering rather than burning, but you cannot force it. Impatience at this stage produced uneven heat, hot spots and cold spots, and food that was burned on one side and underdone on the other. She had learned this through years of cooking and through the occasional meals that had demonstrated it empirically. And she had arrived at a state with her brazier that was less like control and more like relationship. She knew how it liked to be started, what it needed in its first half hour, when it had reached the even heat that meant it was ready. And it, in whatever sense a brazier can be said to respond, performed reliably when treated with this understanding. The pot that sat over her brazier was the centre of this evening's production, and the pot itself was worth a moment's attention. It was terracotta, dark red, round-bottomed, with two small loop handles worn smooth from years of being lifted by the same hands. Its rounded bottom sat in a ring of clay that kept it stable over the heat. It had belonged to her husband's mother, passed to them when they set up their own household, and it bore, near the base, the small crack that had been filled with a paste of ground pottery clay and olive oil 11 years ago, and that was now so thoroughly healed over and incorporated into the pot's general surface that you could only find it if you knew where to look. She always knew where to look. She checked it sometimes, not anxiously, just the habitual check of someone keeping track of something that matters. The lentils in this pot had been soaking overnight. She had put them to soak yesterday evening with the forward planning of a cook who thinks 2 meals ahead as a matter of course, and then cooking since about the middle of the day. They were Egyptian lentils, the small brown ones that were one of Rome's most common foods, cheap and nourishing and versatile, appearing in the diets of everyone from senators who thought it fashionable to affect simple tastes to the truly poor who ate them because they were among the cheapest calories available. She added the onion first, a whole one, and skins removed, cut roughly into large pieces that would soften completely into the stew over the long cooking time. Then garlic, 4 cloves, each one pressed flat with the back of the knife and then roughly chopped. Then the dried fig, 1 medium fig, its particular sweetness making the lentils richer and more complex without being detectable as a distinct flavour, which was the whole point. Then cumin and coriander, both ground from whole spices she had ground that morning in the small stone mortar that sat in the corner of the main room, the mortar and pestle being among the household's most essential implements. Then olive oil, a generous pour, the good oil for cooking, not the best oil which she saved for finishing dishes and for the lamp, but good oil, fruity and green, the kind that filled the room with its scent when it hit a hot surface. Then a splash of wine, the half-empty amphora of ordinary vinegary wine that was one of the background constants of Roman cooking and present in every kitchen, used for everything from marinating to deglazing to making the cook feel slightly better about standing over a hot brazier for an extended period. Water to cover, a lid, the flat terracotta disc that exactly fitted the pot's rim, and time. 2 hours of gentle, barely simmering time, during which the apartment filled slowly with the smell of the cooking, a smell that deepened and shifted as the hours passed. The raw smell of lentils becoming the savoury smell of onions softening, becoming the warmer, more rounded smell of garlic releasing its sugars, becoming the complex, layered, deeply satisfying smell of a finished dish. She stirred now. The wooden spoon, long-handled, warm from the heat, slightly stained with the colours of 100 previous meals, went around the pot 3 times in each direction, lifting the lentils from the bottom, distributing the heat evenly, reading the texture through the wood in the way of experienced cooks. Perfect. The lentils had reached that state of near dissolution that was the goal, broken down enough to create a thick unctuous broth, still substantial enough to give you something to eat. She tasted from the side of the spoon, blowing on it first, waiting one careful moment. Salt, a little more salt, The pinch and crumble of coarse salt crystals between her fingers dissolved immediately into the stew. Better, much better. From the landing, from the other families, came the smells of their respective suppers. The family across the landing had fish tonight, something fried in olive oil with garlic, the smell good and clean and carrying a faint note of the sea. The elderly woman at the end of the landing had her small pot of something herbed and wine-scented, the smell of it reaching out into the shared air of the stairwell with a diffident gentleness that matched, she had always thought, its maker's personality. And from below, from the bakery, the smell of the day's last baking. The bakery's stone oven was a massive thing, built into the shared wall between the two buildings, a permanent installation of volcanic tufa stone that held heat for hours after the last fire was raked out. The smell it produced in the evening was different from the morning smell of active baking, less yeasty, less active, more like the memory of bread, the warm exhalation of a stone that has been making bread all day and is still quietly finishing the job. The woman found this smell one of the most comforting things in her daily life, which she had never quite articulated to herself as such, but which she would have confirmed immediately if someone had pointed it out. Her daughter had come to lean against her, drawn by the smell of the cooking as much as by anything else, drawn by the warmth of the brazier and the warmth of her mother's presence, both of which occupied the same space and were in some sense the same warmth. She pressed against her mother's side and looked into the pot with the serious inspection of someone who takes food very seriously. She said, "It smells ready," her mother said, "nearly." She said, "Is that the fig?" Her mother said, "Can you smell the fig?" She considered. She said, "Maybe. I think maybe." Her mother said, "Good nose." Her daughter accepted this compliment with the composure of someone who already knew it was true. The bread she had bought that morning was wrapped in cloth on the shelf above the brazier, warming in the ambient heat. 2 flatbreads from the bakery below, thick, unleavened, with the particular texture of a bread made from a slightly coarser flour than you might ideally want, but baked in a stone oven hot enough that the surface was slightly charred in places, and the interior was dense and good and completely satisfying. They ate bread at every meal. Everyone in Rome ate bread at every meal, one way or another. The grain dole, the annona, was one of the basic systems by which Rome kept its enormous urban population from starvation, distributing grain to hundreds of thousands of citizens monthly, grain that went to the bakers and came back as bread. This bread, their bread, from the bakery below, was as fundamental to their daily life as the water they carried and the air they breathed. The charcoal shifted. The flame at the edge of the coal bed flickered briefly, a small orange tongue licking at the air, then settled back. The pot bubbled, a single heavy bubble from the centre, and was quiet again. The smell of cumin and lentils and warm bread occupied the entire air of the landing, drifted up the stairwell, participated in the building's collective evening smell. Fire and bread. They have always been here, at the centre of the home. They were here before Rome. They will be here after Rome. They are here right now, wherever you are, in whatever form. The warm breath of the stove, the smell of the kitchen, the particular comfort of something being made for you, or by you, in a warm room at the end of the day. It is the oldest comfort there is, and she knows it perfectly. He came up their stairs just as the light was going, which was how she always knew it was him. Not by his footstep exactly, though she did know his footstep, knew it well enough to distinguish it from the footsteps of their neighbours even when she was not paying attention, knew its particular weight and rhythm, the slight asymmetry of a person who has stood on one leg while working for years, and whose body has incorporated this asymmetry into its basic locomotion. She knew him by the timing. He had a craftsman's body clock, synchronized to the light, the way craftsmen's clocks have always been synchronized to the light, before there was any other kind of clock that mattered. When the light went from gold to amber, when the shadows collected in the corners of the workshop, when the customers who had lingered in the late afternoon began to look at the sky with that particular expression that meant they were calculating whether they had time for one more transaction. That was the moment, the natural signal of the end of the working day. His hands set down whatever they were holding, his body stretched. He came upstairs. He was a suitor, a sandal and shoe repairer, in the broad sense, a worker in leather, though his particular specialization was footwear. The suitors of Rome are not the people history records. They do not appear in the annals of Tacitus or the letters of Pliny. No monument celebrates them, no triumph was dedicated to the shoemakers of the Subura, but they were essential to the city in the most literal possible sense, because Rome was a city of walkers. And a city of walkers is a city that wears out its footwear, and a city that wears out its footwear needs someone to mend it. Romans walked everywhere. The city had no wheeled transport for citizens during the daylight hours. The same law that confined carts to the night also created, by default, a city where every journey was a walking journey. And they walked in leather sandals, the calcei or the more casual soleo or the work shoe version of each, that required regular maintenance. The sole wore thin, the straps cracked, the rivets worked loose, the leather dried out and lost its suppleness and needed conditioning. A pair of good sandals represented a real investment for a person of ordinary means. Not something you discarded when it started to wear, not when someone like our craftsman could restore it to serviceable condition for a fraction of the cost of replacement. Just breathe. The evening is warm and close and everything is settled and safe. Let the sounds of the workshop below grow distant and quiet. Let the work of the day drift away from you, like smoke going up into the sky. His workshop was one of the tabernae on the ground floor of the building, the left one closest to the stairwell entrance, so that the women going out for water in the morning often exchanged a word with him on their way, and the children coming home from the schoolmaster often paused to watch him work through the open frontage of the shop. It was about 12 feet deep and 8 feet wide, with his workbench along the back wall and his tools hung on pegs above it in an arrangement he had established during his first week there, and that had not changed significantly since. The arrangement made immediate sense, in the way that a craftsman's tool arrangement always makes immediate sense, not arbitrary, but organized by the logic of use, the most used tools in the most accessible positions, the less used ones further away. To an outsider, the organization might have looked haphazard, even cluttered. To him, it was a system so thoroughly internalized that he could reach for any implement in complete darkness and find it where it lived. The primary tools, the awl, a slim, sharp-pointed instrument of iron and bone handle for punching the small, neat holes through leather through which the stitching passed. The curved needle, of iron, slightly bent to facilitate the pushing through of thick leather. The lasts, wooden forms in the exact shapes of feet, ranging from infant size to large adult, over which leather could be stretched and shaped and dried into the form of a shoe. The knife, in several sizes, all kept sharp, because sharp knives cut leather cleanly while dull knives tore it. The smooth stone for burnishing edges, pressing down the freshly cut leather to create clean, sealed edges that would not split. The wooden mallet for joining rivets. The scraps of leather, sorted by type and quality into clay pots along the right wall, each pot containing a different grade. The thick sole leather, the thinner strap leather, the very thin decorative leather for the upper surfaces of finer work. He greeted his family with the comfortable brevity of a man who has been talking all day, in the particular professional manner of tradespeople. Attentive, patient, courteous, managing the small social negotiations that each customer brings along with their footwear. His family got the other version of him, the version that did not need to perform anything, that could be simply present, simply tired, simply grateful for the particular relief of being in a room where nothing was required but your actual presence. He touched his wife's arm as he passed. He looked at the pot with the evaluating look of someone who has not eaten since noon and is calculating from the smell how long until supper. He accepted the cup of wine she poured him with both hands, the formal two-handed acceptance of something you genuinely want. His hands. Sit with his hands for a moment. They were craftsman's hands, shaped by 20 years of the same work, into something that was entirely specific to that work. The fingertips had the thickened, slightly glazed quality of skin that has been in regular contact with leather and tools for many years. Not calluses exactly, though those were present too at the key contact points, but a general toughening and smoothing that extended across the whole working surface of the hand. The right forefinger and thumb had a particular smoothness at the very tips, a kind of polish that leather takes on from constant handling, as if a small portion of every piece of leather he had worked had left something of itself behind and built up, year by year, into this characteristic surface. The left hand showed different marks, The marks of the holding hand rather than the working hand, the slightly different patterning of force and contact that came from holding leather down while the right hand cut it or stitched it. There were small scars. Of course, there were small scars. 20 years of sharp implement work leaves its tax, the occasional moment of inattention or miscalculation that results in a small cut, quickly healed, quickly forgotten, leaving its pale signature in the skin as evidence. Most of them were barely visible now, old enough to have faded almost entirely into the general surface of the hand. A few of the more recent ones were still pink. He could have told you, probably, the story of each one, the circumstances, the particular moment of the slip, but it was not a set of stories he spent much time telling. They were simply part of his hands, the way all the marks of all the work were part of his hands, evidence of a working life, of a life lived in the making of things. He sat on his cushion near the window and attended to his hands in the way he did every evening, the small ritual of the craftsman at the end of the workday. He flexed his fingers, individually and together, feeling the stiffness work out, the particular stiffness of hands that have been doing the same precise movements for hours, the kind that settles in not as pain but as a slight inflexibility, a reluctance to open fully or close fully that responded quickly to the deliberate movement of stretching. He pressed his thumbs into the base of his palms, first the right, then the left, working at the deep tension that had built up there through the day, pressing in small circles with the focused attention of someone performing a necessary maintenance task. He rolled his wrists forward and backward, the small joints clicking occasionally. She watched him do this from across the room without appearing to watch. The unconscious peripheral attention of a person whose awareness of another person's well-being is continuous and unremarkable. She had watched him do this every evening for 11 years, and she found it neither boring nor extraordinary. It was simply what he did, part of the evening's pattern, like the smell of the cooking and the sounds of the building, part of him. The Roman craft guilds, the Collegia Opificum, the associations of working tradespeople, were one of the most important social institutions in the lives of people like him. The suitors would have had their collegium, their regular meeting place, a rented room in a particular building, or a shared space beneath a temple portico, their collective feast days and funeral fund and mutual support network. For a man of his social position, modest means, no political connections, no powerful patron. The collegium was the organized community beyond the family, the group of people who understood what your work was like because they did the same work, who could recommend you to customers when you had more work than you could handle, who would help if your workshop was damaged or your tools stolen, who would contribute to your funeral expenses if you died before you had saved enough to cover them yourself. He had apprentices. 2 boys from families he knew in the neighborhood, 12 and 13 years old, in the early years of learning a trade that would take the better part of a decade to fully acquire. He taught them in the way his master had taught him, mostly through demonstration and repetition, through the patient accumulation of experience, through the correcting of mistakes at the moment of their making, rather than through any formal instruction. The vocabulary of the craft was transmitted mostly in silence, in the gesture that redirected an incorrectly held tool, in the example of the correctly performed operation, in the gradual internalization of what right looked like and felt like until it became impossible to do it wrong without knowing it. His daughter climbed onto his lap while her mother was at the pot. She had done this her whole life, arrived at his lap with the expectation of a small creature who has no doubt about its welcome, leaning back against his chest with the full weight of a 7-year-old who has stopped bothering to hold herself up because being held up is available. She looked at his hands where they rested on either side of her, the large hands that she had been examining since she was old enough to examine anything. She picked up his right hand and held it flat, then pressed her own small hand against it, comparing. The scale difference was considerable. She pressed her fingers against his fingers, one by one. She said, "When I grow up, will my hands look like yours?" He said, "Probably more like your mother's." She considered this. She said, "But will they be good at things?" He said, "Yes, definitely yes." She said, "What things?" He said, "Whatever you decide to do with them." She thought about this for a while, with the focused absorption of a child processing information that has been given to her in earnest, not deflected or simplified. She folded her fingers against his. She said, okay, the supper was nearly ready. He could smell it, had been smelling it since the landing, the concentrated warmth of the lentil stew, the bread somewhere in the background, his stomach making its impatient evaluation. He looked at his wife across the room, her back to him, stirring, entirely focused on the pot, and then not entirely focused, turning just enough to catch his eye over her shoulder. A look, a brief, unperformed look of mutual acknowledgement that contained, if you were paying attention, something that had taken 11 years to build and could not be reduced to any single feeling. Contentment, not perfect, not untouched by the ordinary stresses and sorrows of an ordinary life, but genuine, deep, rooted. The particular contentment of two people who have chosen each other in the most complete sense, not just once in a ceremony, but over and over in the daily small choices of a shared life. His daughter was humming something against his chest. He did not recognize the song. He let her hum. The daughter fell asleep, as she always did, fighting it with everything she had. This was her characteristic relationship with sleep. A total, principled refusal to acknowledge its approach until the moment of absolute defeat, followed by the sudden and complete surrender of a soldier who has defended an indefensible position to the very last. She would be sitting in her mother's lap, clearly drowsy, her eyes glazed and slightly unfocused, her limbs going heavy, and she would fight. She would ask a question. She would readjust her position. She would announce that she was not tired. She would perform an elaborate demonstration of wakefulness that convinced no one, least of all herself, and then her head would dip, and dip again, and finally fall all the way forward, and she would jerk awake with the offended expression of someone who has been ambushed. She had been doing this since she was a baby. Her mother had ceased finding it frustrating approximately 9 months after it started, and had since found it consistently, quietly wonderful. The son's relationship with sleep was entirely different. He had always gone down quickly, completely, like a stone dropped into deep water, the contact made, and then gone immediately below the surface, entirely undetectable from above. Lately, this had acquired some of the characteristics of adolescent sleep, which meant that it arrived with more difficulty in the evenings, resisting the hour that he was expected to sleep in favor of the hour that was slightly later, while simultaneously making itself known at mid-morning with an enthusiastic depth that could have brought stones back to life. But the underlying quality of his sleep was the same: committed, total, impervious. Once he was down for the whole night. They had eaten supper together in the usual way, the family together on the floor of the main room. Cushions arranged in a loose circle around the brazier's trivet, the pot set in the centre where everyone could reach it, the bread torn into pieces and distributed, the cups of watered wine poured. They ate with their hands, mostly, dipping bread into the stew, using the bread as both utensil and substance, occasionally deploying the flat wooden spoon that lived in the pot as a serving implement. This was how most Romans of their social position ate. The elaborate bronze and silver dining service of wealthy households was not part of their world, and they did not experience their meals as diminished by its absence. Food was food. The bowl in your hands, the spoon, the bread, the company, that was supper. That was sufficient. That was many evenings rather good. Let that old world drift by while you rest, my friend. You don't have to hold any of it. Just let the images come and go, as warm and slow as the lamplight. There is nothing required of you. Just breathe and be here and let the story find you. The conversation at supper was the conversation of a family at the end of a day. The accounting of what had happened, offered and received in the compact shorthand of people who know each other well enough not to need preamble. The son's description of his half-day at the fuller's workshop, the enormous treading vats, the smell, which he rendered with the combination of accuracy and theatrical suffering that 14-year-olds reliably bring to any experience involving discomfort. His father saying that you got used to it. His mother saying flatly that you did not, and that anyone who told you otherwise was either lying or had permanently damaged their sense of smell, which produced a laugh from the son that was mostly genuine and a raised eyebrow from the daughter, who did not quite understand the joke, but understood that one had been made. The daughter's account of the chicken on the stairs. A story that had apparently been waiting for exactly this audience, because she told it with a narrative satisfaction that suggested she had been composing it in her head all afternoon. The chicken's expression, the chicken's demeanour, her own response, The chicken's eventual departure, direction unknown. The Roman approach to childhood education was practical, class-specific, and notably different from what we tend to think of when we hear the phrase Roman education, which tends to conjure images of wealthy children being tutored in Greek philosophy. That was real, but it was the education of a small minority. For the majority of Rome's children, education meant the ludus, the primary school, conducted informally in any available public space by a ludi magister who was typically of modest social status himself and charged modest fees. Children learned to read, to write in a basic way, and to do the fundamental arithmetic that would serve them in commercial and domestic life. The goal was functional literacy and numeracy, not scholarly achievement. Beyond the ludus, most learning was vocational and absorbed in the doing of things, in the workshop, in the kitchen, in the market. The son had finished his formal schooling 2 years ago. By his father's judgment and with his own agreement, he could read the signs above shops and the inscriptions in the street. He could calculate prices and quantities and the simple accounting of a small business. He was learning his father's trade in the workshop and separately developing the more general commercial awareness that was the real curriculum of a young man of his position in Rome. He was, at 14, quite capable and knew it, and was navigating with some impatience the period between being capable and being treated as capable, which is perhaps the universal experience of 14-year-olds in every century. The daughter was still attending the ludus 3 mornings a week, under a schoolmaster whose opinion of her was, as her mother had been told in confidence, exceptionally favourable. She read already with a facility unusual in her age group. She asked questions of a kind that the schoolmaster found unusual. Not the ordinary questions of curiosity, but questions that seemed to be testing the edges of what was known, checking whether the map had blank spaces and what might be in them. Her mother kept this assessment to herself, not out of modesty, but out of the practical wisdom of a parent who knows that a child who becomes aware of being exceptional is sometimes a more difficult child than the one who is simply going about the business of learning. After supper, the clearing, which was a shared operation, parcelled out by habit, the son taking the pot to the landing to be rinsed with the last of the day's water, the daughter gathering the cups and the serving spoon, the father folding the cushions back against the wall, the mother sweeping the main room floor with the short broom that lived in the corner, the brief brisk movement of the broom, raising a small cloud of tile dust that was quickly dispersed by the air from the window. The room transformed in these few minutes from supper room to sleeping room, the cushions against the walls becoming sleeping mats tonight, the space in the centre opening up. The lamp moved to the small shelf where it lit the room better when people were lying down than when they were sitting. The children's room preparation was mostly the province of the children themselves, at their ages, the daughter getting into her sleeping tunic with the efficiency of a small person who has been doing this independently for at least 2 years and has strong opinions about how it should be done, the son draping himself across his mat with an air of exhaustion that was not entirely theatrical. He had genuinely worked hard today, and his body knew it, and his body was 14 and required enormous quantities of sleep, in a way that his body at 20 would not, but that right now it communicated without any possibility of argument. The daughter sat on her mat with her knees up and her chin on them, the listening posture she took when she was winding down, but not yet ready to give up the day. She listened to the building. Her mother had noticed over the years a particular receptiveness to the sounds of the building. She had been asking about the neighbours' sounds since she was 4, with a persistent curiosity of someone taking a complex thing apart to understand it better. She said, "Who is the old woman upstairs, really?" Her mother sat down beside her. She said, "You know who she is." She said, "I know her name, but I don't know who she really is." Her mother considered this. It was a real distinction. The child had found something genuinely worth thinking about, which she often did. She said she has lived here longer than we have. She came from somewhere else, a long time ago, before I knew her. She used to have a husband, but he died many years before we moved here. She lives alone now, and she seems to like it, mostly, though I think she also likes to be listened to when she talks. She said, "What does she talk about?" Her mother said, "Many things. Old stories. Things she has seen." She said, "Do you think she misses her husband?" Her mother said, "I think she does sometimes, but I think she has also made peace with it, in the way that people do when they have had a long time to think about something. A pause. She said, "I think she is a little lonely at night." Her mother said, "I think so too sometimes." She said, "We could knock on her door sometimes." Her mother said, "We could." "We do sometimes." She said, "More sometimes." Her mother said, "Yes, more sometimes." Good idea. The eyelids were losing their battle now. They had been losing it for about 15 minutes, since the last question had received its answer, and no new question had arrived quickly enough to hold them up. Her mother watched the battle play out, the slow dip, the recovery, the second dip, with the tender, unhurried attention of a parent who has been watching this particular performance for years and loves it every time. She tucked her daughter in. This was not a ceremonial act. There was no elaborate bedtime ritual, no sequence of songs or stories, though there had been when the child was younger. It was simply the practical laying down and covering up of a small person who was already, by the time her mother's hands reached her, more asleep than awake. The blanket smoothed. The child's hair moved back from her face. The quick, light press of a mother's hand against a child's forehead. Not checking for fever, just touching, the way you touch the things you love, simply to be in contact with them. She stayed kneeling there for a moment after the child's breathing evened, listening to it. The slow, deep, completely trusting breathing of a small person who feels completely safe. What the children know, that the world is warm, that supper tastes better when everyone is there, that the old woman upstairs has a good footstep, worth listening for, that sleep is coming whether you fight it or not, and fighting it is good, but losing is okay too, because where you land is soft. These are not small things to know. These are, in some sense, everything. The mother stood in the doorway of the children's room for a long moment after tucking her daughter in, her hand still resting on the edge of the curtain she had drawn across. She looked at both of them in the dark, her daughter curled on her side, the blanket pulled up to her chin, her breathing already steady and deep, her son sprawled on his mat with his arm across his face, one foot dangling off the edge, completely gone, completely elsewhere. She had the thought that she always had in this moment, looking at her sleeping children, the thought that was not quite articulable, that did not arrange itself into words, but that was something like, "This. This is the thing. This is what all the work is for." She did not need to say it aloud. She did not need to say it to anyone. It was sufficient that she knew it. Standing here in the doorway in the dark, with the sounds of the building and the city around her, and her children sleeping in the room she had made for them, she let the curtain fall. She went back to the main room, where the lamp was burning and her husband was at work. She sat down, and she felt the particular quality of a good evening. Not exceptional, not memorable in any way that could be described to someone who had not been in it, but good, plainly and sufficiently good. The way an evening is good when everyone in the household is safe and fed, and the lamp is burning, and the work is done, and the children are sleeping in the other room with their particular ways of sleeping, each one entirely themselves, even in sleep, even in unconsciousness, even in the dark. The insula had a sound at night that was different from all its other sounds. Not silence. The word silence barely applied to this building at any hour, and certainly not in the first hours of the night when the city outside was at its most active, and the families within were settling at different speeds towards sleep. But there was a quality to the sound of the building in the evening hours that was distinct, softer, more interior, less purposeful. The sound of energy being gathered in rather than expended out. The sound of people doing the private things of evening, putting children to bed, tending the last of the evening fire, attending to whatever small tasks remained. In the particular manner of people who have done these things 10,000 times and have arrived, through repetition, at a state of nearly mindless efficiency, doing them in the comfortable half-consciousness of deep habit. She sat in the main room, in the warmth of the lamp, with nothing she was required to do, which was a state she arrived at rarely and valued highly. Her husband was at the table. She could hear the small sounds of his work, the focused silence of a craftsman doing something that required attention, punctuated by the occasional controlled sound of the tool making contact with the material. He had brought up the sandal with the broken strap that a customer needed by morning. A repair he could do in an hour, probably, with the particular quick competence of a craftsman working on something he had done 100 times. She was aware of him working in the way you are aware of a lamp burning, its warmth and light present, not requiring acknowledgement, just there. She listened to the building. You are warm, my friend, and perfectly safe in the dark. The building breathes around you too in its way, all the warm air of a resting evening, all the soft sounds of things settling. Nothing from the world outside can reach you here. Just let your body go heavy and warm, and let the sounds come and go around you like the tide. The family directly above them, the dock workers' family, the couple with 3 children, had had one of their low, persistent arguments earlier in the evening, the kind that never quite rose to shouting and never quite resolved to silence, sustained instead at the particular frequency of 2 people who loved each other and were, in this specific hour, driving each other to the limit of their patience. She had not listened deliberately. The sounds were simply there, available, the way the sounds of a large family in a small building are always available. The argument had, eventually, resolved. She had heard the shift, the change in quality that meant the sustained tension had given way to something else, something softer, possibly involving the acknowledgement of weariness, which is often how arguments between genuinely loving people resolve. Not through the triumph of either position, but through the exhaustion of both parties, arriving simultaneously at the awareness that they would rather be at peace with each other than be right. Shortly after, there had been quiet, and then, she was fairly certain, sleep. This was the knowledge she had accumulated, over 11 years in this building, about the people who were her involuntary intimates, the neighbours whose lives she knew not through any deliberate inquiry, but through the simple continuous unavoidable proximity of shared walls and shared stairwells and shared air. She knew the dock worker was a good man who worked too hard and came home too tired to be at his best in the evenings. She knew his wife was more resilient than she seemed, with the particular quiet strength of someone who has been managing more than was visible for a long time. She knew their children's names and their ages and their approximate temperaments. She knew that they would be fine. The elderly woman above them, Grandma Faustina, as the children had christened her, a name the woman had adopted for the same reason her children had, because it was accurate in the important sense, if not the genealogical one, had been humming this evening, as she did most evenings, for some period after she had gone to her room. The humming was a characteristic of hers that the woman had known almost since they moved in. It was quiet, contained, meant for no audience, the kind of humming that a person does when they live alone, filling the silence not because the silence is threatening, but because music is how the human mind thinks, sometimes, and alone in a room there is no reason to keep it in. The melody was the same few bars, cycling and returning, a fragment of something older than memory, something the old woman had known since childhood. The Romans were, by necessity, people who lived in proximity. The Insulae created, almost automatically, a community that was denser and more intimate than most of us would choose today, a community of shared space and shared sound and shared smell, in which privacy was a concept that existed mainly at the level of the room and not at the level of the building. This was not comfortable in every respect. There were arguments through walls. There were smells from other families cooking that were sometimes less welcome than others. There were children who cried in the night, and adults who snored, and the occasional drama of illness or birth or death that gave the whole building an awareness of being implicated in each other's lives, whether they had chosen to be or not. But within this involuntary intimacy, something else also grew, something that we might try to call community, though the word has become somewhat depleted through overuse. Call it instead this: the practical care of people for people nearby. Last winter, when one of the families on the 3rd floor had been hit with a fever that took down both parents simultaneously and left 3 small children in need of attention, it was the neighbours who stepped in. Not because anyone asked, not because there was any formal system for this, but because the problem was visible and the solution was available, and the people who were available were the people next door. Food appeared at the door. An older child from downstairs came to sit with the youngest children. The old woman from above brought something medicinal, herbs in wine, a remedy of uncertain efficacy but certain warmth. The family recovered. This was the unwritten contract of the insula, unspoken and uncodified, but as real as any law. You will know your neighbours, because you cannot avoid it, and knowing them you will help them when help is possible, because the next person who needs help might be you. It was not idealistic. It was simply practical. The practical ethics of people who lived in each other's laps and had worked out empirically that the arrangements that worked best were the ones where you paid attention to the people around you. A baby cried somewhere above. One of the dock workers' children, probably the middle one, who had a habit of crying briefly in the first hours of the night before settling again. The mother's voice came immediately, low and quick. The voice that is not quite speech and not quite song. The voice that simply means I am here, I am here. The baby's crying faded. The woman listened to the fading of it with the attention of someone who knows exactly what it means and what will happen next. She heard the small sounds of settling, then quiet. A door on the landing opened and closed, the soft sound of someone making a quiet nighttime trip, trying not to disturb. Footsteps, brief, returning. The particular creak of a door settling back into its frame. Then silence, and then the resumption of the building's general nighttime sound, which was the sound of breath. Many kinds of breath, in many rhythms, from many rooms, all slightly different, all contributing to the same ambient quality of life continuing in the dark. Her husband set down his work. She heard it in the quality of the silence that followed the work sounds. A different silence, a softer one. The silence of a person who has finished rather than a person who is concentrating. He stretched. She heard that too, the slow release of the long stretch, the small sounds of the body unmilitating itself from the sitting position. He was quiet for a moment. Then she was aware of him attending, of his focus turning away from the sandal and toward the room toward her. She did not look at him. She did not need to. She simply felt the shift in the air of the room. The way a room changes when the quality of attention in it changes. When a person who was elsewhere comes fully present. They sat in the quiet together, in the warm light of the lamp. The building breathed around them. All its families, all its lives, settled for the night or settling. The particular intimate music of the Insula at this hour, rising and falling around their small room like water around an island, like a home. And this is the thing I come back to. Whenever I think about the Insulae, whenever I try to explain to myself why these buildings and the lives lived in them move me so much, it is precisely this quality of involuntary intimacy that makes them, in their way, one of the most human environments ever created. We spend a great deal of our contemporary energy trying to manage the distance between ourselves and other people, the acoustic insulation, the private entrance, the careful arrangement of our spaces, so that the presence of neighbours remains theoretical rather than actual. And there are good reasons for this. Privacy is a real good. The capacity to live your life without constant exposure to the scrutiny and interference of others is something worth having. But something is also lost in the management. Something that the Insula gave its residents, whether they wanted it or not. The knowledge that they were embedded in a web of lives, that their existence was noticed and their difficulty would be seen. The woman in the building across the landing who brought food when someone was ill. She was not performing an act of charity in the formal sense. She was doing what proximity made inevitable. She knew, because she could not help but know, and knowing, she acted. The structure of the Insula made that knowledge unavoidable, and therefore made the action natural rather than effortful. This is not a simple good. There are people for whom the knowledge that their lives are known is not comfort but exposure, not warmth but surveillance. The Insula could be oppressive in exactly the ways that close communities can be oppressive. Demanding conformity, punishing difference, exacting a social tax for belonging that some people would prefer not to pay. All of this was real, and yet, in the dark of this particular night in this particular building, what she felt was not surveillance or pressure or the weight of the community's expectations. What she felt was simply, we are here together. All of us, in our separate rooms, living our separate lives, making our separate choices and our separate meals, and managing our separate difficulties, and also here, in this building, together. Overlapping, mutually present, known. There are worse things to be than known. Rome did not beat night, not fully, not even close. The popular image of the ancient city after dark, shuttered, silent, dangerous, the streets given over to the worst elements, captures something real but misses something larger. It misses the essential fact of a city of 1 million people, which is this. 1 million people have needs, and needs do not observe the sun. The baker needs to bake before dawn. The city needs to be supplied with the goods that feed and maintain it, and the supply wagons can only move at night. The sick need attending, the very young and the very old need watching. The people whose work is the night work of large cities need to go back and forth from wherever they are to wherever they are going. The city breathes differently at night, but it breathes. The Romans, practically, had addressed one of the key problems of urban density, the conflict between pedestrian street life during the day and the supply needs of the city. With a characteristically blunt solution, they banned wheeled vehicles from Rome's streets during daylight hours. From sunrise to a few hours after sunset, the streets of Rome were in principle clear of carts and wagons. This made the days more navigable for the millions of pedestrians who used the city's streets constantly. It also meant that everything, the grain, the wine, the marble, the timber, the amphorae of olive oil, the clay for construction, the firewood, the thousands of tons of goods that Rome consumed daily, had to be delivered at night. The result was that the nights in Rome's residential neighborhoods were not quiet. The nights in Rome's residential neighborhoods were, from the perspective of the people trying to sleep in them, somewhat actively hostile to sleep. The sound of cart wheels on stone paving, the protest of oxen navigating corners that were not designed for them, the calls and curses of drivers managing difficult loads in narrow streets. This was the soundtrack of Roman urban nights, regular, constant, and not gentle. Just breathe, my friend. The street is below and you are above it, warm and held. The sounds of the night city are far away, growing softer now, drifting down and down into something more like weather than sound. Just the background hum of the world doing its work. Nothing that needs attending to, nothing that asks anything of you. Just let it pass. She had learned to sleep through it years ago. This was simply a thing that Roman residents of Roman cities did. They learned the particular sounds of their streets, incorporated them into the map of normal that allowed the sleeping mind to ignore what was familiar and attend only to what was strange. The sound of the cart was familiar. The sound of the usual ox, taking the usual corner at the usual hour, made by the usual driver whose voice she would have recognized if she had ever learned his name. This sound asked nothing of her. She slept through it, the way she slept through the building's nighttime settling, the way she slept through the sounds of her own family breathing. But she was not asleep yet. She was at the window, on her stool, in the particular twilight state between the day's awareness and sleep's approach, watching the street in the way that is not quite watching, not alert, not searching for anything, just present to whatever was there. The street below was doing what it always did at this hour. The last foot traffic of the evening was thinning. Individuals and small groups, moving with the purpose of people who know where they are going and are getting there, not the browsing and lingering of the daylight hours. A woman walking quickly, something wrapped under her arm. Two men in conversation, one of them gesturing widely, the other watching the gestures with the expression of someone who has heard this before and is waiting for it to finish. A dog trotting in the central channel of the street with a perfectly clear sense of mission. Then the first cart. This was a heavy one. She could hear it 2 streets away before she could see it. The particular resonance of iron-rimmed wheels on stone that carried through the ground and the walls and the air, simultaneously, a deep percussive sound beneath the sharper sound of wheel on stone. The ox's footsteps were audible too, the heavy, patient forebeat of a large animal walking, not hurried, not slow, just walking. The driver's voice once, a brief directional note, not a command exactly, more like a suggestion. The cart came around the corner and into her street, and she saw it, a wide, low platform loaded with amphorae stacked and lashed securely in their horizontal rows, each amphora pointing upward like a soldier. They were the large cargo amphorae, about 3 feet tall, narrow-necked, sealed with pitch, and there were perhaps 40 of them on the cart, which made the cart's total load enormous by any calculation. Olive oil probably, or wine. The great goods of Rome's commercial life, arriving in the night from Ostia and the river docks to be distributed to the wholesale merchants, who would then distribute them to the retailers, who would then sell them to the households, who would use them. A chain of commerce so thoroughly normal that no one involved in any part of it gave it much thought, but which constituted, in aggregate, one of the logistical achievements of the ancient world. The driver was sitting on the front of the cart, with the relaxed posture of a man in his natural environment. He held the reins loosely. The ox knew these streets, probably made this same circuit every night, had long since internalized the route. The driver's eyes moved over the street ahead with the professional calm of someone who is being paid to deliver a load intact, not to react to the scenery. As the cart passed beneath her window, he glanced up. Not at her specifically, just the glance upward that people make when they pass lit windows at night. The quick acknowledgement of the visible light in the dark. She saw his face briefly in the lamplight from her room, broad, unreadable, doing its job. Then the cart was past and the sound was diminishing, and the street was quieter than it had been. This is what I find myself thinking about. At this moment of the evening, that driver. His name, like the woman's name, is nowhere in the historical record. He was one of thousands. The teamsters and their oxen, the nighttime supply chain of the largest city in the Western world, going about the business that kept Rome fed and stocked and functioning. He would have done this same circuit, or a circuit very like it, most nights of the week, for years, perhaps for his entire working life. He would have known every street in Rome's night geography, every corner that was tight, every surface that was particularly rough, every building where the proprietor occasionally came out in the small hours to receive a delivery personally and to exchange a few words in the quiet of the late night. He would have had his own family, somewhere, sleeping while he drove. He would have been tired. And yet, there was something about his work that I think was not entirely without its satisfactions. The nighttime city, the city that most of his fellow Romans were sleeping through, was his particular Rome. He knew it at an hour that few people knew. He moved through it with a competence born of long familiarity. He was, in his own domain, exactly capable. A flute from somewhere, not nearby, perhaps 2 streets over, or 3. The sound made indeterminate by its travel through the night air and the intervening buildings. Not a professional performance. The quality of the sound was exploratory, searching, a person playing for themselves in the quiet of the late evening, not performing but thinking, using the instrument the way some people use walking, as a way of sorting through what is in the mind. A few phrases repeated, a slight variation, the same phrases again. The flute was, in ancient Rome, the most common of musical instruments, played at every level of society and in every context from sacred rites to street entertainment to exactly this, someone in a room above a street, in the middle of the night, playing quietly for no one. She listened to it until it stopped. The vigils, Rome's night watch, its combined fire brigade and police force, passed by below at their regular hour, 3 of them walking together at the measured pace of a patrol that has covered this same ground enough times to have internalized its duration. She heard them more than saw them. The sound of organized footsteps, slightly synchronized, and the brief warm light of their torch sweeping through the gap in the shutter and crossing the ceiling above her. She watched the light come and go, 3 seconds perhaps. Then the footsteps receding down the street, the torch's light moving on, the vigils carrying their small moving island of illumination through the dark city that was their domain and their responsibility. The stars above the roofline of the opposite building were clear tonight. She could see, perhaps a dozen from this angle, just the strip of sky between the buildings, but enough. The bright one directly above was steady and cold and very far away, and had been there every clear night of her life, and had been there every clear night of everyone's life who had ever lived in this city, and would be there long after. The city was nothing but a memory and a ruin, and a subject of scholarly debate for people who had never seen it alive. She found this comforting, in the quiet, reasonable way that she found most things comforting when she thought about them long enough. The stars were beyond the reach of anything that happened below them. They persisted through everything. They were there now, they would be there tomorrow, they would be there when her daughter's daughter stood at this window, or at some other window, and looked up. She pulled back from the window. She turned back to the room. The lamp was burning low. It was nearly time. But she stayed at the table for a moment, sat down on the stool, set her elbows on the wood, rested her chin in her hands, and thought about neighbours. Not anything in particular. Just the word, the concept, the daily reality of it. She had grown up in a different city, in different arrangements, and had been brought to Rome in circumstances that had not included the luxury of choosing neighbours. And yet she had, somehow, arrived at this building, and stayed in it, and found within it something that she had not expected to find in a city of 1,000,000 strangers. a community that she had not chosen and could not leave, and that she would not have left even if she could. The Romans had a concept. She had heard it discussed once, at a collegium dinner, by a man who read too much philosophy for anyone's comfort. Of the res publica, the public thing, the shared thing that belongs to everyone, and therefore to no one in particular. She had thought at the time that this was a concept for people with marble fountains and senatorial togas. But sitting here now, in the quiet, thinking about the families on every floor of this building, the dock worker and his wife making up after their argument, the old woman above whose lamp sometimes burned the latest, the young couple on the third floor still learning the art of living together, the family at the end of the landing with their 3 children who spilled into the shared space like an irrepressible tide. She thought, perhaps the res publica was here too. Perhaps it was always here, in the smallest, most mundane version, the shared staircase, the shared landing, the shared fountain down the street, the small public things, the things that connected you to the people around you, whether you had chosen them or not. Her husband set down his work. She heard the familiar sounds, the tool placed carefully on the table, the leather folded, the small flex of his back releasing the day's tension. She looked at him. He looked at her. The lamp was burning low between them, its flame diminished now, honest about its remaining fuel, making the most of what it had. She did not need to say anything. He did not need to say anything. They were together in a room they knew by heart, at the end of a day they had both lived through, and there was a quality to the silence between them that was not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence. The silence of 2 people who have been talking long enough and well enough that not talking is also a form of speaking. The building breathed around them. The city breathed below. And she sat for a moment more in the lamp's last good light, simply being in it, simply being here, before the lamp and the day and the evening all came, quietly and completely, to their end. The lamp on the table was a small thing, and I want you to look at it carefully with me for a moment before it goes out. Terracotta, the basic material of so much of Roman domestic life, the ubiquitous stuff of kitchen and table, and lamp and storage vessel, and practically everything else that could be made from shaped and fired clay, which was cheap and available and practical in ways that more precious materials were not. This lamp was formed in a mould, one half pressed into the upper mould, the other half pressed into the lower mould, the 2 halves joined while still soft and smooth together at the seam, then dried and fired in Ilm, along with dozens of others exactly like it, made by a potter who made hundreds of them a month and sold them for a price that any working family could manage. It had a small filling hole at the top, barely wide enough for a finger, through which the oil was poured. It had an elongated nozzle at the front through which the wick protruded. A twist of flax fibre, the same material from which their clothing was partly made, soft and slightly grey at the tip where it had been burning. The whole lamp was about the size of a large man's fist, designed to fit comfortably in one hand, light enough to carry anywhere. In 11 years of use, the lamp had acquired the particular character of a well-used object. The outer surface had darkened from its original terracotta red to a deeper, smokier colour, the accumulated patina of years of burning. The nozzle was discoloured in a permanent way around the wick hole, a browning of the clay from oil that had warmed and crept over the edge and dried there. The underside had the smooth, worn spot of having been set down on the same surface, in roughly the same orientation, countless thousands of times. It was, like her pot and her spoon and her water amphora and all the other objects of daily use, thoroughly itself, specific, familiar, shaped by its history of use into something that had a character the original object from the mould had lacked. The oil in the lamp was olive oil, a grade better than the cheapest pressing but not the finest, bought specifically for lamp use from a merchant who knew her requirements and reserved a regular supply. Good lamp oil burned cleanly and brightly with minimal smoke. Poor lamp oil, pressed late in the season from inferior fruit or stored in conditions that caused it to oxidize, burned with more smoke, a richer, more acrid smell that stained walls and lungs, and with less consistency of flame, the light fluctuating in ways that made reading or fine work difficult and that created, in the evenings, a quality of flickering unease rather than steady warmth. She had used poor oil in bad months, when money was short, and she knew the difference. Tonight the oil was good, the flame was steady. The Romans had a word for the light of a lamp that I find beautiful. Lumen. The same word that gives us our word luminary, our word illuminate, our word luminous. Light, in Latin, was lumen, and darkness was not the absence of lumen, but its own substantial thing. Tenebrae, the shadows, the darkness, almost a physical presence in the ancient imagination. The lamp pushed back the tenebrae. Not far, its radius was small. Its competition with the dark was always a local and limited victory. But within that radius, the lumen held. You're warm, my friend, completely warm, and the world outside is dark and still, and none of it belongs to you right now. Just let yourself be in this small, warm circle of light, this intimate radius of lamplight and evening quiet. You don't have to do anything with it, just be in it. Across the building, the lamps were going out. She was aware of this as a gradual diminishment of the ambient light level, the light that seeped under doors and through window shutters from other rooms and other apartments, contributing its small fractions to the building's general illumination. First the lamps of the families with young children, whose evenings ended earliest. Then the lamps of the floor above, floor by floor descending, the building becoming darker in layers from top to bottom. The old woman's lamp, which sometimes burned the latest of all, a small persisting glow, visible through the ceiling in the last hour of the night, had gone out a while ago, or moved deeper into her room, where its light no longer reached the stairwell. Outside, the city's lights were doing their own thing. Rome at night was not dark the way we imagine pre-electric darkness. The combined light of a million lamps in a million windows, of the torches carried by the vigiles and the wealthy who could afford torch bearers, of the fires that burned in the city's workshops and temples and public spaces, this added up to a quantity of ambient light that made the city visible from a distance, that gave the hills around Rome a faint orange glow on clear nights that travellers described as seeing the city from far off. Rome at night glowed, not brilliantly, not with the relentless intensity of our cities, but it was there, that glow, the collected light of the gathered million, visible as a kind of warmth against the dark sky. She had the copper funnel in her hand, the small, precise instrument for filling the lamp without spilling. She held it over the filling hole and tilted the small oil vessel slightly, watching the oil thread down through the funnel in a thin stream, dark and gleaming, slowing as the lamp approached its fill point. She watched the level carefully. A lamp filled too full would overflow when the oil warmed, which was wasteful and potentially dangerous. She stopped when she judged it right. The oil vessel was set down. The funnel was wiped with a cloth and placed in its box. She looked at the flame. I want to stay here for a moment. I want to stay with the lamp and the flame, and the woman looking at the flame, because there is something here that I find I cannot rush past. The lamp was the centre of domestic life after dark in the ancient world, in a way we have almost completely lost access to imagining. We live now in an age of abundant, constant, inescapable light. We can make it appear instantly anywhere we are. We can have as much of it as we want. It costs so little that we mostly do not even think about the cost. Our darkness is chosen darkness, artificial darkness, the darkness of a blackout curtain chosen to exclude the light we have more than enough of. Her darkness was real darkness. Her light was small, tended, precious, in the way that things are precious when they are made from effort and resource, rather than from the press of a switch. The filling of the lamp, the maintenance of the wick, the decision about when to trim it and when to let it burn down. These were daily acts of attention and care that we have entirely outsourced to the infrastructure of the modern world. She did them herself, every day, as fundamental a domestic task as cooking or water carrying, without which the evenings would have been genuinely dark, genuinely limiting. And because she did them herself, because she attended to this small flame daily and personally, she had a relationship with it that we do not have with our light sources. She knew this flame. She knew how it behaved, how it responded to air currents, how it changed when the oil was running low, how the trimmed wick burned differently from the untrimmed one. The flame was, in a small way, a presence in her domestic life, a small living thing that required her care and gave her light in return. She picked up the small iron scissors, thin-armed, precise, made for this purpose, and leaned over the lamp. With a quick, clean motion, she trimmed the wick. A fraction of an inch, the charred tip removed, the fresh fibre exposed. The flame jumped at the small disturbance of the scissors, dipped, wavered, and then strengthened, brighter, steadier, the fresher wick drawing oil more cleanly, better. She watched it for a moment. Then she leaned forward. She brought her face close to the lamp. She felt the warmth of the flame on her cheeks, on her forehead, a delicate warmth that became less delicate the closer you got to it. The boundary of comfort and discomfort, located precisely in the inch or two between where she was and where the flame was. She took a long, slow breath in, filling her lungs completely, feeling her chest rise. She held it for one moment, and then she breathed out, slowly, gently, a long and measured exhale aimed at the flame. The flame bowed. It flattened, leaned away from her breath, fought for a moment in the way that small flames fight disturbance, holding on. And then, without drama, without sound, it went out. The room fell dark. Not completely dark. The city's ambient light seeped through the shutter's edge, the thinnest ribbon of orange-grey. But the lamp was out, and the room was in the kind of darkness that was warm and close and entirely, completely safe. The darkness of a room she had lived in for 11 years. The darkness that had everything she needed already in it. Her husband's breathing, close. The building, settling. The city, murmuring, and her, in the warm dark still. She lay without moving for a moment, feeling the transition, the change from the lit room to the dark room, from the visible to the invisible, from the world held by the lamp's small authority to the world released back to itself. This transition, which she made every night, and had been making every night for as long as she had been responsible for the lamp's management, was, she sometimes thought, one of the small ceremonies of daily life that went entirely unremarked, but deserved more attention than it got. There was something meaningful about it. Not dramatic. She would not have used the word meaningful, probably, since it was too large for what she was describing, but something real. The choice to put out the lamp was also the choice to end the day. It was an active thing, not a passive thing. You did not simply run out of light. You chose to extinguish it. You leaned forward and breathed out, and the flame bowed and went. And with it the day's last possibility of doing anything productive, of seeing anything clearly, of being in the world in the way that light made possible. After the lamp, you were committed to rest. The dark had authority you could not override. She found this, had always found this, in some way she could not quite articulate. A relief. The lamp's extinction was permission. Permission to stop, permission to be done, completely done, with the day's requirements and the day's possibilities and the day's 1,000 small decisions. Done. In the dark, resting. She listened to the city, to the building, to her husband's breathing. She let her eyes close. They were already closed, really, had been closed since she lay down. But she let them close in the deeper sense, the sense of releasing the habit of looking, of registering the darkness as actual and permanent for this night, rather than as a temporary inconvenience before the next lamp was lit. Dark, warm, still, safe, the best conditions there are for sleep. In the dark, after the lamp, the mind does its own slow work. During the day, thinking was something that happened in the interstitial spaces. The thought you had while your hands were carrying water, the memory that surfaced while the lentils were being stirred, the idea that arrived while you were folding cloth and then dissolved before you could hold it. The day was too full of other things for thinking to take its full form. It surfaced in fragments, in flickers, and then it was gone. But in the dark, in the quiet, in this hour that belonged only to her, the thinking could open up, could take its time, could follow a thread to wherever the thread wanted to go. She did not direct it. She had long since learned that trying to direct your thoughts before sleep was a losing proposition, that the thoughts which came in this hour had their own agenda, their own logic, and the best you could do was pay attention and not resist. She thought about her mother. This was where she usually ended up, in this hour, at this particular time of year, when the evenings were a certain temperature, and the light through the window at dusk had a certain angle, and the smell of the cooling air was familiar in the way that autumn always felt familiar, as if autumn belonged to a category of experience that the body remembered independent of specific years and places. Her mother had loved the autumn. She had said it was the season for thinking, because the summer was too distracting, and the winter was too dark, and the spring was too optimistic, and the autumn was the season of the mind. Her mother had been dead for 6 years. She had died in the city of her birth, far from Rome, in the company of family members the woman had not seen since she was young. The news had arrived weeks after the fact, in the slow, uncertain postal system of the empire, carried by a traveller who had known someone, and who had passed the message along the chain of connection that substituted for ordinary people without official means for a postal service. She had received it on an ordinary afternoon in an ordinary week, and had sat down on the floor of the main room and been very still for a long time. She had not been there. That was the grief she carried. Not the grief of loss itself, which was universal and expected, which she had known was coming since her mother was growing older, and the distance between them was growing uncrossable, but the specific grief of not having been there, of not having been in the room, of there having been no moment of goodbye, no presence, no hand. Just breathe easy, my friend. You can let the grief rest tonight too. Whatever you carry, you can set it down for now, in this warm dark. There is no urgency here. There is only this moment which is safe and whole. But she did not think of her mother only with sorrow. That was important. The dominant feeling, when she let herself sit with it fully, was not sorrow but gratitude. The deep, slightly aching gratitude that you feel for people who have shaped you without choosing to, who gave you things you didn't know were gifts until you had occasion to use them. Her mother had given her the brazier starting technique, the fig in the lentils, the habit of standing at windows and attending to the light, the capacity for patience with children, which was not a natural trait but a learned one, learned by watching a woman who had it in abundance and never seemed to run low. She thought about freedom. She came back to this thought often, not obsessively, not anxiously, but with the genuine reflective interest of someone who has had an unusual experience and continues to find it worth examining. She had been enslaved in her childhood, a reality that she thought about with the directness of someone who does not require the softening of euphemism, who has processed what happened and found a way to carry it that does not require constantly managing its emotional weight. She had been enslaved, and then she had been freed, and then she had made a life. The sequence mattered, the outcome mattered, but the middle part, the years between her enslavement and her freedom, was something she did not deny and did not dwell on in equal measure. It had happened. She was here. Freedom had arrived in her late teens, granted by the household that had owned her in the transaction that the Romans called manumission, a formal legal procedure by which an enslaved person was recognized as a Roman citizen and a free person, as different in its legal implications as it was possible to be from the condition it replaced. She had been given her freedom partly as a genuine act of kindness. She believed this, she had evidence for it, and partly for the reasons that Romans freed people that were purely kind-hearted, including the social prestige of the act and various practical considerations. The reasons did not much matter to her now. The result was what mattered. She had arrived in the freed community of Rome with the legal standing of a Roman citizen, no money, no family in the city, and a set of practical skills that were fortunately immediately marketable. She had found work. She had found her husband through the network of freed people in the Suburra neighborhood, a network dense enough to facilitate the meeting of people who might otherwise have remained strangers in the city's million-person crowd. She had started building her life, not from the ground up exactly, but from a point close to it, with the determination and the competence of someone who understood what it meant to work with what you had and to make of it what you could. And here she was, 11 years later, in the dark, in her own rooms, in her own building, her own children sleeping, her own husband breathing beside her. This was what she had built. It was not large, it was not grand, it did not feature in any official history of anything, but it was entirely undeniably hers. She thought about her daughter who was going to be something. This was not a mother's hope, or it was a mother's hope, but it was grounded in observation, in the specific evidence of the child's particular intelligence and particular tenacity, which were qualities that the woman recognized because they were her own qualities, and she knew what they could do. She thought about what Rome might offer the girl, what this city of 1 million people, with its appetite for talent and its imperfect but real history of social mobility, might make available to a bright, determined freedwoman's daughter in 20 years, 30 years. She did not know. The future was, as always, opaque, but she believed in it, in a way she found difficult to explain precisely but entirely authentic. The future was worth believing in. For her children especially, the future was worth believing in. She thought about the supper, about how the fig had been right tonight, the amount right, the timing right, the way the lentils had come together at exactly the moment she needed them to. This seems like a small thing, and it was a small thing, and it gave her, in this quiet hour, a disproportionate satisfaction that she also did not try to explain, but simply felt. The meal had been good. Everyone had eaten it with appetite. Her daughter had said it smelled good. Her husband had eaten his portion slowly, appreciatively, in the way he ate things he found genuinely nourishing. The meal had been good. These are the things she thought about. Not the great questions, not the philosophical subjects that the philosophers in their colonnaded schools down in the Forum district were presumably debating. Not empire, not the nature of the gods, not the theories of the Stoics or the Epicureans, though she had opinions, formed through the accumulated evidence of a life lived, about how much of either school was actually useful in practice. Just the small things. The fig, the light at the window, her daughter's face going to sleep. This is what strikes me most, sitting here with her in the dark. The profound ordinariness of what she thought about, and the profound sufficiency of it. How fully these small things, considered in the dark, added up to a life that was worth living, worth examining, worth being grateful for, not despite their smallness, because of it. Because the small things, attended to, are not small at all. They are the substance of existence. They are what existence is actually made of. When you peel back the narratives and the ambitions and the fears, and find what is left is the fig in the lentils, and it is enough. It has always been enough. She thought about something else, something that arrived in the slow associative way of this near-sleep thinking, without being summoned. She thought about the building's history, about the families who had lived in these rooms before them. Not anyone she had known. These people before her time in the building, before the landlord she paid her rent to had even owned it. But people, nonetheless. People who had swept this same floor, cooked over a brazier in this same corner of the landing, looked out this same window at this same strip of sky. She did not know their names any more than history knew hers. But they had been here. They had left. In the walls and the floors and the particular worn spots on the stair, the evidence of their presence. The third step's creak, which must have been developing for many years before she arrived. The faint line where a previous tenant had once hung something on the wall and the plaster had been slightly disturbed. The particular smoothness of the threshold between the main room and the inner room, worn by the accumulated crossings of feet she had never known. These anonymous predecessors were a kind of company, she had always thought. Not in any mystical sense, she was too practical for mysticism, but in the simple literal sense that their having been here made the place more thoroughly itself, gave it the depth and weight of accumulated time. A room that has been lived in for generations is different from a room that has just been built. It has been broken in the way that useful objects are broken in by use, made more fully what it is by the engagement of many lives with its particular surfaces and angles and dimensions. She was part of that accumulation now. Her 11 years were in the building, her mornings carrying water, her evenings at the brazier, her daughter's small handprint that had somehow ended up in the painted vine border at shoulder height. That was there now. That was permanent. That would be there for whoever came after. She had added herself to the building the way all the others had. She was part of its history. She let herself drift. There is a time in the night when even Rome grows quiet. Not silent, never completely silent. Not this city, not ever, not in this century of its maximum expansion and maximum vitality. But there was a time, somewhere in the deep middle of the night, between the last of the supply carts that had set out from the river docks at dusk and the first of the bakers who rose before dawn to begin the city's bread. When the sound of Rome fell to its lowest possible register, when the streets were nearly empty of human movement, when the dogs had finished their territorial announcements and gone wherever dogs go in the quiet hours, when the flutes and the voices and the negotiated sounds of commerce and social life had all gone inside or gone to sleep, when what remained was Rome itself, the stone and the brick and the water and the stars, existing without comment. This was the city breathing, not performing, not working, not governing, not trading, not building its empire or celebrating its gods or managing its grain supply or any of the 1,000 other things that the city did continuously and with remarkable efficiency during its waking hours. Just the city, in the deep hours, breathing, being what it was underneath all those activities, an enormous, ancient, complicated, living thing. She was aware of this quality of the city now. the settled, deep breath quality of Rome in its quiet hours, in the way that you are aware of things when you are very nearly asleep and not quite, when the boundary between waking perception and dreaming has become permeable and things arrive from both sides without clearly declaring which side they come from. Just let yourself drift, my friend. You don't have to hold anything. The story is here with you, warm and slow, and you can let it carry you wherever you need to go. Just breathe. Just be here, in this warm dark, with the old city breathing around you. The building was doing its own version of the city's breathing. Old buildings have their nighttime voices, the sounds of materials that have been heated by the day and are slowly, over the long hours of the night, releasing that heat back into the air. Wood contracts as it cools, producing the particular creak that is the nighttime voice of every wooden-framed building that has ever been built in a climate with temperature variation. Plaster, drying differently in the cooler air, makes its own sounds, not dramatic sounds, barely audible sounds, but sounds that the attentive ear can hear and that the deeply familiar ear has long since indexed as normal, as building settling, as no cause for concern. Stone breathes more slowly. The terracotta tile of their floor, the brick of the outer walls, the stone of the stairs. But it breathes too, in its way, the almost imperceptible dimensional changes of thermal cycling that accumulate over years into the characteristic cracks and repairs and settled appearances of very old masonry. She had heard the building breathe every night for 11 years. She knew its voice in the deep hours, the way she knew her husband's breathing, her children's breathing, the individual characteristic sound of each one, the particular rhythm and depth, the small variations that meant something and the small variations that meant nothing. The building had never frightened her in its settling sounds. From the very first night she had slept in this room, the building's nighttime voice had seemed to her not threatening but companionable, the sounds of a large thing existing in its characteristic way, making its characteristic adjustments, continuing as it had been continuing, and would continue. Above her, the floor of Grandma Faustina's room was quiet. The old woman was sleeping. Her particular quality of nighttime quiet was identifiable. The absence of the humming and the occasional movement and the light that crept through cracks, replaced by a different quality of silence, a sleeping silence. She slept well, the old woman, for someone who was old enough to have reasons not to. Her breathing, on the rare occasions when the woman had been close enough to hear it, was slow and deep and regular, the breathing of someone who had made peace with enough things to let the body rest. Below her, the workshop was dark and cold. Her husband's tools were on their pegs. The last of the customers had departed hours ago. The partially repaired sandal was done now. She had heard him set the work down before they slept. The workshop would resume its life at dawn, when the first early morning customers might stop by before continuing to wherever they were going, the early morning being one of the brisk times for street-level commerce. But now it was still, dark. A small room with a wooden counter and pegs and leather scraps, and the smell of tanned hide that had permeated every surface so thoroughly that it would probably smell of leather for as long as the building stood, regardless of who worked there. She thought about the city as a living thing, not a metaphor exactly, not a way of speaking, but as a practical reality. 1,000,000 people breathing, all of them processing oxygen, all of them releasing carbon dioxide, all of them converting food into heat that escaped into the city's air, all of them dreaming their dreams and turning in their sleep, and occasionally calling out in the night in the half-language of dreams. If you could add up all that breath, all that oxygen consumed, and all that warmth generated, you would have something genuinely atmospheric. The city itself creating a kind of climate, a slightly warmer, slightly more humid air than the surrounding countryside. The thermal output of 1,000,000 lives lived close together, and all of it in this hour at rest. All of it having set down its daily work in 100 different ways, in 1,000,000 different moments scattered through the evening hours, and arrived at this, the night, the quiet, the breathing. The Tiber was out there somewhere, flowing. The aqueducts were out there, flowing. The water they brought to Rome from the mountains did not stop at night, continued its gravity-fed journey through the conduits regardless of the hour, arriving at the city's fountains and flowing from them constantly, the city's heartbeat of water, steady and reliable and indifferent to the hour. The forum was empty. its great paving stones reflecting the starlight in the way of all smooth stone surfaces on clear nights. A faint luminosity, the stone giving back what the sky gave it. The temples were dark. The Colosseum, not yet built in this particular year of this particular century, did not yet exist in the city's skyline, would not for another 15 years or so, depending on the exact date of our evening. But the other great monuments were there, dark and vast and empty of people, existing in their own way, in the deep of the night, as the great public works of Rome existed whether anyone was using them or not. The aqueducts, the roads, the forums, the harbour at Ostia, all of it operational and patient and simply there. She existed in the middle of all of this, in a specific room, in a specific building, in a specific neighbourhood of this specific city, and was aware of it only at the level that we are always aware of the enormous structures within which our small lives are embedded. Not in detail, not consciously, but as a kind of backdrop, a felt sense of the scale and age and persistence of the world you inhabit. She was here, she was small, the city was vast, the night was large, the stars above the roofline were unimaginably far away. All of this was simultaneously true and entirely compatible with the also true fact that her husband was beside her and her children were in the next room and the building was doing its nighttime settling and the day had been a good day as days went. The breathing of the building went on. The breathing of the city went on. Her own breathing had slowed. She could feel it. The long, slow rhythm replacing the slightly quicker rhythm of wakefulness. The body doing what it always did when the mind finally let go. The body knowing exactly what it needed and taking it efficiently once the permission arrived. She was very nearly gone. The images were coming very slowly now. The thoughts had dissolved into something else. Not thoughts exactly, not images exactly, just the warm, undifferentiated awareness of existing, of breathing, of being in a warm room, in the middle of the night, in the middle of the city, in the middle of her life. Rome breathed around her. She breathed with it. The aqueducts were still running. She knew this without thinking about it. The way you know a constant thing, the way the city's water was simply always there in the background of awareness, always arriving, always flowing from the mountains, through the pipes and channels and fountains down through the streets. Somewhere, far above the city, the water was moving through the stone channels by gravity alone, pulled toward Rome by the simple fact of the city being lower than its sources, by the basic physics of water finding its way downhill, as water always does, as everything tends eventually toward its lowest possible state. She found this calming. She had always found it calming, this thought of the aqueducts in the night. The image of water moving steadily toward Rome in the dark while the city slept, arriving at the fountains and falling into them and flowing away through the street channels, the whole system operating without pause, without needing anyone to tend it in this particular hour, simply doing what it was built to do. Reliable, patient, indifferent to the hour. She was like that, she thought, in her best moments, or she tried to be. Reliable and patient, continuing through the night hours when the visible work was done, the invisible work still proceeding, the breath, the heart, the body doing what it did, without asking for attention or direction, just continuing, just persisting in its good necessary ongoing work. She breathed, the city breathed, the water moved through the dark toward the fountains of Rome. And then, at the very end of the evening, at the end of the long, warm, ordinary, entirely sufficient evening, there was still one lamp, not hers. Hers had gone out an hour ago, or longer. She had lost track of time in the way you do when you are approaching sleep, when the intervals between things cease to be measurable and become instead a quality of texture, a feeling of more or less time having passed rather than any specific count of minutes. Her lamp was out. The room was in its comfortable dark. But somewhere in the building, she knew this with the soft certainty of someone who had been lying in this room in this building long enough to read it by feel. Somewhere above her, one small lamp was still burning. She could not see it. She could only know it the way the dark knows light nearby, by a very slight, barely there quality of the dark, something one shade less than complete, something that registered not in the eyes but in the skin, in the general awareness of the body lying in a familiar room and reading that room through all the channels of accumulated familiarity. One lamp, somewhere, still burning. Whose lamp it was, she did not know exactly. Probably the old woman. Faustina tended to burn her lamp later than the others, not because she worked late, but because she sometimes had difficulty sleeping, and she liked, on those nights, to have the lamp burning. It was company, in the most literal sense. The small warm presence of a flame in a room where a person was the only other warm thing. She thought about this. About the old woman in her room, on the floor above, in the still small hours of the night, with her lamp burning and her thoughts doing whatever old thoughts do in the late night when sleep is being difficult, when the mind has covered its usual ground and is circling back, when the memories are more present than the present, because the present is just a dark room and the memories are everything else. You're safe, my dear friend, completely and perfectly safe. Whatever this night holds for you, it holds you too, gently, completely. You don't have to do anything with the darkness. Just let it be around you, warm and close, like a room you know by heart. Her husband's breathing was the slow, deep, completely regular breathing of a man in deep sleep. The breathing that had accompanied her to sleep every night for 11 years, that had become as much a part of the night's sound as the building, settling, and the city below. She was aware of his hand, which had found hers at some point. She could not remember when. Some point between lying down and this moment, the unconscious navigation of a sleeping person toward warmth, lying across her palm with a loose, heavy weight. Not gripping, not intentional, just there. She was on the edge of sleep now, and she knew it, and she was not resisting it anymore. She had come through the whole evening, through the cooking and the supper and the children's bedtime and the quiet hour and the looking out the window and the lamp going out, and she had arrived here at the threshold with nothing left undone that needed doing tonight, nothing pressing, nothing waiting. Tomorrow would come and bring its own requirements, its own small urgencies, its own particular texture of a day. But tomorrow was not here yet. Here was now. Here was the weight of the blanket. Here was her husband's hand. Here was the building's nighttime voice. The small familiar creak from somewhere above, so known it barely registered, just another note in the composition of the place she lived. Here was the very faint sound of the city, coming through the closed shutter, a distant rumble, a voice somewhere, gone before she could locate it, the city breathing in the deep of the night, and here, somewhere above her, the last lamp, burning its small patient burn, keeping it small company, doing, in its way, the thing that the lamp has always done, holding off the dark for one more person, one more hour, one more small moment of warmth in the vast dark of the night. I find myself thinking at this moment about all the last lamps in all the buildings, in all the cities, in all the centuries. The last lamp in a Stone Age shelter, tallow and reed, someone lying awake with a child who was sick, keeping the fire going. The last lamp in a medieval farmhouse, candle stub, someone listening to the wind. The last lamp in a city apartment, electric now, someone reading in the dark while everyone else is sleeping. All of these people, keeping their small flame going, sitting with the night, being awake when everything else was asleep. Not lonely, exactly, more than that. More aware, in that particular late-night solitude, of the enormity of the dark and the remarkable, persistent smallness of the flame that kept going anyway. She was falling now. The edge had been crossed at some point she had not noticed, which is how it always happened. Not a moment of crossing, but a gradual permeation, the waking mind becoming more and more like the dreaming mind, until the distinction no longer held, until it was just mind, just the warm interior of a human consciousness releasing its grip on the day and falling back into the deep country of sleep where everything was different and nothing was required. The last lamp above her was still burning. She no longer knew this. It was burning for someone else now, in a room she was not in, a warmth that belonged to someone else's night. She was gone, down into it, the deep, the warm, the dark. Her breathing was slow, and even barely audible, entirely regular. The breathing of a person in the deepest possible sleep, the sleep that repairs everything, the sleep that the body has been moving toward since morning, that the whole long day of work and care and attention was always going to arrive at. Her husband breathed beside her. Her children breathed in the next room, and through the building, through all the floors, through all the families, through all the separate lives, living their separate nights in their shared building, the breathing went on, all different, all recognizably the same, the slow collective respiration of people at rest, people who had worked their day and fed their families and laid down their work and let themselves be carried into the night, people who were, in this moment exactly as every person has ever been at the end of a sufficient day. Warm, still, alive, surrendered to sleep. The last lamp burned on above them. The city moved below them. The night held them all, everyone, in its enormous, patient, indifferent, entirely sufficient dark. And somewhere at the edge of waking and dreaming, at the very last moment before sleep takes everything, she felt it. The thing she always felt, on the good nights, on the nights when the day had been what it was supposed to be. The feeling that was not quite happiness and not quite peace but contained both of them. The feeling that was simply this: we are here. We are all right. We are home. There is one last thing I want to say about the last lamp, about the fact that it was still burning, somewhere above, while she slept, about whoever was keeping it burning. There is always, in any community, someone who stays up last, someone whose sleep comes later than the others, or not at all on some nights. Someone who sits with a lamp while the rest of the building is dark, in the private hours of the late night, doing whatever it is that people do when the day's requirements are done, and the night offers its unusual, slightly strange freedom of solitude. We do not know what Grandma Faustina, if it was Grandma Faustina, was doing in those hours with her lamp burning. Maybe she was mending something, her eyes still good enough in lamplight for close work. Maybe she was simply sitting, the way old people sometimes sit in the night, with a quality of stillness that is different from sleep, that is more like resting inside the self rather than escaping it. Maybe she was thinking about the city she had arrived in so many years ago, and comparing it to the city it was now, and marveling at the things that had changed and the things that had not. Maybe she was humming, very quietly, the few bars of the old melody, the one that had no name. Whatever she was doing, the lamp was burning, and its small light was in the building, part of the building's nighttime presence, part of what made the building itself in the dark hours. One person still awake, one flame still holding the night at arm's length. The last light in the Insulae, doing its patient, necessary, tender work. And below it, in the rooms of the building, everyone sleeping. The woman finally deeply asleep. Her husband beside her. Her children in the next room. The dock worker's family. The arguing couple reconciled. The building full of sleeping people. All their individual urgencies set aside for the night. All their separate stories paused at the same moment, in the same building, in the same city, under the same sky. The last lamp burned, the city moved, and the night continued its great and patient work of carrying the sleeping world through the dark hours toward the morning. Let me stay with you for a little while longer. Before the story fully dissolves into the dark, before the last image fades, and the last word releases itself into whatever space words will go when they are finished being said, let me sit with you here, in the warm and quiet dark, and say a few things that I find myself wanting to say every time I think about this woman and this building and this evening. Things that have been building in me through all the hours of this story, and that want, now that we have reached the end of the evening, to come out and be said simply, without embellishment. I have been thinking about the Insulae for a long time, not just as historical architecture, not just as the subject of archaeological papers and structural analyses, and the endlessly debated question of how many stories the average insula had, but as places where people lived, where they went to sleep at night and woke up in the morning and experienced every form of human feeling that there is, in rooms whose walls were painted ochre and whose floors were terracotta tile and whose windows looked out onto streets full of people doing the same thing. I have been thinking about what it means that these places existed, that they were home to millions of people for hundreds of years, and that when they finally came down, eroded, demolished, superseded by different buildings as cities always supersede their own buildings, they left behind people who had been formed by them, who carried the particular knowledge of what it meant to live in that kind of proximity, in that density of community. What strikes me first, and most forcefully, when I think about our woman and her evening, is how familiar it is, how recognizable. This is the thing that I find most extraordinary about looking closely at ordinary ancient lives. Not the difference which we expect, which we are prepared for, but the similarity which surprises us every time, even though it shouldn't, because human beings have been human beings for a very long time, and the essential structure of human experience does not change as rapidly as our technology or our social arrangements. She cooked a meal, she tended a flame, she put her children to bed. She sat in the quiet after the children were down and let her mind do its own work. She looked at the stars. She fell asleep in a dark room beside the person she had chosen to share her life with. Every single one of these things is something that hundreds of millions of people did last night, will do tonight, have been doing for as long as people have lived in households, which is as long as people have been people. The specific form differs. The terracotta pot becomes the cast iron pan, becomes the stainless steel saucepan, the oil lamp becomes the candle, becomes the electric light. But the act, the tending of the fire, the making of food, the putting to bed of the children, the quiet hour, the stars, the act persists. This is what has always been true. This is what the Insulae demonstrate. If you look at them not just as engineering or archaeology, but as evidence of human experience, that the essential structure of domestic life, warmth, food, family, light, rest, has not changed in any fundamental way across the whole span of recorded history. We have gotten better at providing these things in many ways. We have gotten safer. We have gotten warmer in the literal thermal sense. We have solved many of the problems that made insular life genuinely difficult. The fire risk, the absence of running water, the relentless proximity without recourse. These are real improvements and they matter. But the need for these things, the warmth, the food, the family, the light, the rest, that has not changed. That will not change. That is not a historical contingency, but a human constant. I think about the insulae themselves, these apartment blocks that Rome invented and that every city since has reinvented, and I see in them something that I find genuinely moving. The answer to a question that every city eventually asks, which is how you house a large number of people in a limited space without destroying their humanity. The Romans' answer was not perfect. No answer to this question ever has been, but it was creative and practical, and it worked in the sense that it provided homes, actual homes, real homes, to 1 million people in a city that could not have functioned without them. The insulae were not ideal. They were real. Real is often better than ideal, in the way that things you can live in are better than things you can only admire. Let the night carry you, my friend. Let all these thoughts drift by like boats on a slow river. You don't need to hold any of it. It's all just here with you, warm and gentle, and you can let it pass or let it stay, whatever feels right. Just breathe. I think about what we have lost in the privacy of modern urban life, and what we have gained, and whether the trade has been a good one. I think the answer is, as it almost always is with genuine trade-offs, both yes and no, in different proportions depending on who you are and what you most need. We have gained privacy. The ability to live your life without every detail of it being available to the people on the other side of a thin wall. We have gained space. The room to move through your home without bumping into everyone you live with. The room to have an argument at a volume appropriate to the emotion, rather than constrained by the acoustics of a communal building. We have gained the freedom from the particular stresses of involuntary proximity. The neighbour whose habits are difficult, the argument you are forced to overhear, the illness that spreads through a community simply because everyone shares the same air. But we have also lost the particular comfort of never being alone in the building sense, the particular ease of knowing that the sound of your neighbour in distress would be heard, the particular social fabric of people who know each other because they cannot avoid it, and have discovered that knowing each other is not, on balance, a bad thing, the particular security of the community that exists because the physical structure makes it exist, not because anyone had to choose it or maintain it or consciously sustain it. The woman in the insula did not have to work to be part of a community. She was already part of one, simply by virtue of living where she lived. What she had to do was navigate it, and that is a different and in some ways easier task. What I find most beautiful about her evening, most beautiful and most true, is that she was not living her life in an exceptional way. She was not doing extraordinary things. She was not in a historical moment that anyone would think worth commemorating. She was simply living in the full, daily, repetitive, rich, exhausting, satisfying sense of the word. She was cooking and tending and watching and thinking and resting and falling asleep. One more time, as she had done the evening before and the evening before that, and as she would do again tomorrow evening, God willing, and the building standing. This is the great unremarked miracle of ordinary life, that it keeps going, that it keeps finding ways to be sufficient, even beautiful, within the constraints that any particular era places on it, that the woman in the Roman insula and the woman in the Tokyo apartment, and the woman in the Lagos house, and the woman in the London flat, and every other woman and man and person in every other home in every other city in every other century have found, within their particular arrangements of wall and roof, and fire and food and family, the same essential things: warmth and company, and the quiet satisfaction of having provided for the people they love, and the rest that comes when you have done what the day required. I want to say, finally, and this is the thing I most want to say, the thing I would want you to carry with you, if you carry nothing else from this evening, that her life mattered. Not because it was exceptional, not because it left any mark on the official record, not because anyone remembered her name, which they did not, which they have not for 2,000 years, which may never be recovered. It mattered because she lived it, because she was there, in that building, in that city, on that evening, and she cooked her food and loved her family and looked at her stars and went to sleep. Because she was alive and present and real. Because her realness is not diminished by the fact that no monument records it. Every life that has ever been lived matters in this way. Every person who has ever cooked a meal and looked at the sky and fallen asleep in a room they knew as home has added their particular thread to the fabric of human existence. The fabric is unimaginably large. The threads are unimaginably numerous, and yet each one is itself, distinct, real, woven into the whole in a way that makes the whole what it is. Her thread is in there. Somewhere in the vast weave of all the human lives that have ever been lived, her thread runs through it, warm and ordinary and entirely itself, 2,000 years of nothing between us and her, and yet somehow in some way connected. Good night, woman in the ochre room. You did not need to be extraordinary. You were enough just as you were. You are enough just as you are. And so, my friend, are you, exactly as you are. You are enough. I want to linger here for just one more moment, in this space between the story and the sleep, and say one more thing about what the Insulae meant, not architecturally, not historically, but humanly, in the deepest sense. The Insulae were places where people had no choice but to encounter the full reality of other lives. You could not live in an insula without knowing that the people around you were real, not background figures in your story, not extras in the drama of your particular life, but actual, fully present people with their own dramas and their own lamps and their own lentil pots and their own children, asking one last question before sleep. The structure of the building made this unavoidable. The thin walls made it unavoidable. The shared staircase, the shared fountain, the shared landing with its shared braziers and shared cooking smells. All of it made it unavoidable. And I think this unavoidability was in its way a gift, a difficult, uncomfortable, sometimes unwanted gift, but a gift nonetheless, because the things that matter most about human life, the connection, the witness, the knowledge that your existence is noticed and that you notice others, these things do not grow easily in conditions of total privacy. They grow in proximity. They grow in the cracks between people who live close enough together that their lives overlap without trying to. We have optimized away most of that proximity in the modern world, and gained a great deal by doing so, and lost something too that I do not think we have fully named or mourned. The Insulae, for all their discomforts, knew something about community that our buildings, for all their conveniences, have mostly forgotten. That is the lesson. That is what the ochre walls and the terracotta floors, and the third step that always creaks are trying to tell us across 2,000 years of silence. You need each other. You always have. And so we come gently to rest. The woman is sleeping. The building is breathing its nighttime breath, the slow settle and creak of a structure that has been inhabited and loved and leaned on and returned to for years upon years, that knows the weight of its families the way the earth knows the weight of what grows in it. The city of Rome is doing its deep night thing. The carts and the dogs and the distant flute and the vigils and the aqueduct's endless water, all of it continuing in the background, the hum of a million lives set to a lower frequency now, the city in its deep sleep mode, the city as close to resting as a city of a million people ever comes. And you are here, my friend. You are still here, in the warm dark, drifting. You have travelled a long way tonight, 2,000 years back, across the world, into a small room with ochre walls and a terracotta floor, into the warmth of one particular family's one particular evening. You have smelled the lentils with the fig. You have heard the daughter's last determined question before sleep finally took her. You have sat at the window and watched the cart go by in the lamplight from above, and seen the driver's face for a second, and heard the flute 2 streets over in the warm dark. You have felt what it meant, what it has always meant. Everywhere people have made a home, to be exactly where you belong. I hope it was warm, being there. I hope it was good. This is what I love about this work, about sitting with you in the dark and telling these stories of ordinary people who lived extraordinary ordinary lives in the past. Not the great ones, not the emperors and the generals and the senators, the woman with the lentil pot, the craftsman with the careful hands, the daughter who fought sleep and lost gloriously every time. These are the people I want to know. These are the people I think we are. These are the stories that remind us that we are part of something enormous and ancient and continuous. The long human story of people making homes in the world and finding them, against all reasonable expectations, sufficient. We have always made homes. We have always fed each other. We have always put our children to bed and looked at the stars and turned out the lamp and laid down beside the people we love and breathed the night air and let the day go. This has always been enough. You are part of this story, my friend. You are this story, right now, in your bed or your couch or wherever you are, breathing the same dark air that every person in every century has breathed at the end of their day, warm and safe, and releasing the hours into the night where they belong. You are the latest chapter in a story that started long before any of us and will continue long after. The story of people resting at the end of the day, the story that is really just one sentence, repeated in 10,000 languages across all of time. We are here. We are all right. We are home. Nothing from the outside world can reach you now. Whatever tomorrow holds, it will hold it tomorrow in its own good time. Tonight is yours. This dark, this warmth, this breath, all yours. Completely, fully, finally yours. Sleep, my friend. Sleep as deeply as you need to. Sleep as long as the night allows. Let the rest find every part of you that has been waiting for it. The tired parts and the worried parts, and the parts that have been holding on all day to things that can be set down now, here, in this safe and gentle dark. Rome is somewhere behind you now, warm and breathing, its oil lamps going out one by one, its city settling, its million souls in their million rooms at rest. The woman is asleep. The building is quiet. The stars above the Subura are doing their long, patient wheel across the sky, the same stars that look down on all the lives ever lived, that will look down on all the lives yet to be lived, that are looking down on you right now. As for what comes next, where we go on our next journey together, I will just say this. There is another ordinary life waiting for us, another small room in another part of the world, another set of hands going about their daily work, another evening that is entirely unremarkable and absolutely full of everything that matters. I can't wait to share it with you, but that is for another night. Tonight it is enough to be here. Tonight it is enough to rest. Good night, dear Rome. Good night, dear friend. This is Alan. I will see you next time. Until then, sleep well, sleep deep, sleep warm. You have earned it.